The transformation of the Roman Empire during the 4th century represents one of history's most consequential political and cultural shifts, fundamentally altering the trajectory of European and Mediterranean civilization. This metamorphosis began with Constantine II's audacious decision to establish a new imperial capital at the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, a move that would ultimately create the foundation for what historians now recognize as the Byzantine Empire. Constantine's choice of Byzantium as the site for his new capital was far from arbitrary. The location commanded the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, controlling the vital waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean through the Sea of Marmara and the Dardanelles. This strategic position allowed the new city to dominate trade routes between Europe and Asia, while its triangular peninsula provided natural defensive advantages with water on two sides and only a narrow land approach from the west. The deep natural harbour of the Golden Horn offered secure anchorage for naval vessels and merchant ships, making it an ideal base for both military and commercial operations. The emperor's vision extended beyond mere strategic considerations. Constantine envisioned his new capital as a Christian Rome, free from the pagan traditions and senatorial opposition that had long complicated imperial governance in the old capital. Construction began in 324 CE, with Constantine personally marking out the city's boundaries with a spear, according to contemporary accounts. The building project drew craftsmen, architects and labourers from across the empire, while artworks and monuments were systematically relocated from other cities to embellish the new capital. The physical transformation of Byzantium into Constantinople involved massive construction projects that rivaled the greatest achievements of Roman engineering. The city's walls were extended and reinforced, creating a formidable defensive perimeter. A new imperial palace complex rose on the eastern promontory, featuring elaborate ceremonial halls, private apartments, and administrative offices that would serve as the nerve centre of imperial power for over a millennium. The Hippodrome, modelled on Rome's Circus Maximus, could accommodate 100,000 spectators and became the focal point of public life, hosting chariot races, imperial ceremonies, and popular demonstrations. Constantine's administrative reforms fundamentally restructured the eastern territories of the empire, creating systems that would distinguish them from their western counterparts for centuries to come. The emperor divided military and civilian authority, appointing separate commanders for military districts while civilian governors administered justice and taxation. This separation of powers prevented the concentration of authority that had enabled numerous military coups in the previous century. The Eastern Empire's military organisation underwent significant transformation during this period. Constantine created new elite units, including the Scholae Palatinae, heavily armed cavalry regiments that served as the emperor's personal guard. These units were recruited primarily from Germanic tribes and other barbarian peoples, but unlike their Western counterparts, they were more thoroughly integrated into Roman military culture and hierarchy. The Eastern armies maintained stronger discipline and cohesion, partly due to more consistent imperial presence and better supply lines from the wealthy provinces of Anatolia and Egypt. The bureaucratic structure of the Eastern Empire developed distinctive characteristics that would define Byzantine administration for centuries. The Praetorian prefect of the East emerged as the highest civilian official, overseeing taxation, legal administration, and public works across the vast territories stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. Below him, a complex hierarchy of officials managed provincial administration, with the Comes Orentis governing the crucial Syrian provinces and the Praefectus Aegypti controlling the vital grain supplies from Egypt. Constantine's legalization of Christianity through the Edict of Milan in 313 CE marked the beginning of a profound transformation in imperial ideology and governance. The emperor's personal conversion, whether genuine or politically motivated, established Christianity as the favoured religion of the court and administration. This shift had immediate practical consequences. Christian bishops gained significant political influence, church property received legal protection, and Sunday became an official day of rest throughout the empire. The integration of Christian theology into imperial ideology created new concepts of rulership that would define Byzantine political theory. The emperor was increasingly viewed as God's representative on earth, ruling by divine mandate rather than merely by military conquest or senatorial approval. This theological framework provided legitimacy for imperial authority while creating new obligations. The emperor was expected to protect the church, defend orthodox doctrine, and govern according to Christian moral principles. The construction of churches throughout the Eastern Empire reflected this new religious orientation. The original Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, built by Constantine himself, established architectural and liturgical patterns that would influence ecclesiastical construction for centuries. The emperor's involvement in church affairs extended beyond mere patronage. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to resolve the Arian controversy, establishing the precedent for imperial intervention in doctrinal disputes. The rise of Christianity also transformed the cultural landscape of the Eastern Empire. Traditional Roman festivals and ceremonies were gradually replaced or modified to accommodate Christian sensibilities. The imperial court adopted Christian symbolism, with the Chi Rho monogram appearing on military standards and official documents. Latin remained the official language of administration and law, but Greek continued to dominate daily life and intellectual discourse in the eastern provinces, creating a bilingual elite that could navigate both Roman legal traditions and Greek philosophical heritage. The gradual divergence from Western Rome became increasingly apparent through the development of distinct legal, linguistic, and ceremonial traditions. While the Western Empire continued to rely heavily on Germanic military leaders and settlers, the Eastern Empire maintained more direct imperial control over its armed forces and administration. The Eastern emperors developed elaborate court ceremonies that emphasized the sacred nature of imperial authority, drawing on both Roman traditions and Christian theology to create new forms of political ritual. Legal development in the Eastern Empire reflected this growing distinctiveness. While both halves of the empire theoretically shared the same legal system, practical administration required adaptation to local conditions and customs. Eastern legal scholars began producing commentaries and interpretations that would eventually form the foundation for the comprehensive legal code compiled under Justinian in the 6th century. The influence of Greek legal traditions, particularly in matters of property and contract law, became increasingly evident in Eastern jurisprudence. The linguistic evolution of the Eastern Empire during this period laid the groundwork for the eventual triumph of Greek over Latin. While official documents and legal proceedings continued to be conducted in Latin, the educated classes were thoroughly bilingual, and Greek remained the language of higher education, philosophy, and theology. The Eastern Church developed its liturgy and theological discourse primarily in Greek, creating a cultural divide that would deepen over time. Ceremonial traditions in the Eastern Empire evolved to reflect both Christian values and the increasingly autocratic nature of imperial rule. The emperor's public appearances became elaborate theatrical performances, with precisely choreographed rituals that emphasized his divine mandate and supreme authority. The imperial crown, originally a simple gold band, evolved into an elaborate diadem decorated with precious stones and Christian symbols, visually representing the fusion of Roman imperial tradition with Christian theology. The economic foundations of the Eastern Empire provided crucial support for these political and cultural transformations. The eastern provinces included some of the wealthiest and most productive regions of the Roman world. Egypt's grain production, Anatolia's mineral resources, and Syria's commercial networks generated enormous revenues that funded the new capital's construction and supported the expanding bureaucracy. The Eastern Empire's control over crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia provided additional income through customs duties and commercial taxes. The military challenges facing the Eastern Empire during this formative period shaped its defensive strategies and military organization. Persian threats along the Mesopotamian frontier required constant vigilance and substantial military investment. The Sassanid Empire under Shapur II launched numerous campaigns against Roman territories, testing the new defensive arrangements and forcing the development of sophisticated border fortifications and rapid response capabilities. Barbarian pressures along the Danube frontier presented different challenges. Gothic tribes, displaced by Hunnic migrations, sought settlement within Roman territories, creating complex diplomatic and military situations that required careful management. The Eastern Empire's response to these pressures differed significantly from Western approaches, emphasizing negotiation, controlled settlement, and gradual integration rather than wholesale military confrontation. The relationship between the eastern and western halves of the empire during this period remained complex and often strained. While theoretically united under shared legal and administrative systems, practical cooperation became increasingly difficult as each half faced distinct challenges and developed separate responses. The Eastern Empire's growing wealth and stability contrasted sharply with the Western Empire's mounting difficulties, creating tensions that would ultimately contribute to the permanent division of imperial authority. The accession of Justinian to the imperial throne in 527 CE marked the beginning of the most ambitious and transformative period in Byzantine history. Born Petrus Sabatius in the Illyrian village of Tauresium, Justinian had been groomed for power by his uncle Justin I, a former swineherd who had risen through military ranks to become emperor. The new emperor possessed an extraordinary combination of intellectual brilliance, administrative acumen, and boundless ambition that would define his 38-year reign. Standing of medium height with a round face and penetrating eyes, Justinian was known for his tireless work ethic, often labouring through the night on state documents while his courtiers slept. Justinian's vision extended far beyond mere administration of existing territories. He harboured a profound conviction that the Roman Empire could be restored to its former glory, with all former provinces reunited under a single Christian emperor ruling from Constantinople. This dream of renovatio imperii, the renewal of empire, would drive his most significant military campaigns and fundamentally reshape the Mediterranean world. The emperor's intellectual partnership with his wife Theodora, a former actress who had risen from humble origins to become one of history's most influential empresses, provided crucial support for his ambitious programs. The emperor's first major military undertaking targeted the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, established by Genseric in 429 CE after the barbarian conquest of Roman territories. The Vandals had created a formidable naval power based in Carthage, controlling crucial Mediterranean trade routes and launching devastating raids against Roman shipping. Their Arian Christianity also posed a theological challenge to Justinian's vision of a unified Orthodox empire. The emperor's decision to launch a Reconquest campaign was influenced by a succession crisis in the Vandal kingdom following the death of King Thrasimund in 523 CE. Justinian entrusted the North African campaign to Belisarius, a brilliant young general who had already distinguished himself in wars against Persia. Born in Germania, a region of Illyria, Belisarius possessed exceptional tactical skills and an unusual ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his troops. His army consisted of approximately 15,000 men, including 5,000 regular infantry, 10,000 federates, and a substantial contingent of Hunnic horse archers, whose mobility and firepower would prove decisive in the coming campaign. The Byzantine fleet, numbering 500 transport ships and 92 warships, departed from Constantinople in June 533 CE. The expedition's success depended heavily on speed and surprise, as the Vandal navy could potentially intercept the invasion force in open waters. Belisarius established his base at Caput Vada in modern Tunisia, approximately 160 kilometres south of Carthage, after learning that the main Vandal fleet was engaged in operations against a rebellion in Sardinia. The decisive engagement occurred at Ardecimum, 10 miles from Carthage, where Belisarius encountered the Vandal king Gelimer's hastily assembled forces. The battle demonstrated the superior training and discipline of Byzantine troops, who maintained formation under pressure while the Vandal cavalry charges broke against their steady ranks. Gelimer's brother Amatus was killed in the fighting, and the Vandal army disintegrated when their king fled the battlefield. Carthage fell without resistance, and the local population, largely consisting of Roman descendants who had endured a century of Vandal rule, welcomed the Byzantine forces as liberators. The conquest of North Africa was completed within a year, with Belisarius capturing the Vandal treasury and taking Gelimer prisoner. The campaign's success exceeded all expectations, restoring Roman control over provinces that had been lost for over a century. Justinian established the Exarchate of Africa, a military governorship that combined civilian and military authority under a single official responsible directly to the emperor. The Reconquest brought substantial economic benefits, as North Africa's agricultural production and strategic ports once again contributed to imperial revenues. The Italian campaign presented far greater challenges than the North African expedition. The Ostrogothic kingdom, established by Theodoric the Great in 493 CE, had created a relatively stable administration that preserved many Roman institutions while maintaining Gothic military supremacy. The death of Theodoric in 526 CE and subsequent succession disputes provided Justinian with an opportunity to intervene, particularly after the Gothic queen Amalasuntha was murdered in 535 CE by her cousin Theodahad. Belisarius landed in Sicily with a force of 7,500 men in 535 CE, quickly securing the island before crossing to mainland Italy. The campaign's initial phase proceeded smoothly, with Byzantine forces capturing Naples after a brief siege and entering Rome without opposition in December 536 CE. However, the Gothic king Vitiges assembled a massive army and besieged Rome for over a year, testing Byzantine resolve and military capabilities to their limits. The siege of Rome revealed both the strengths and limitations of Justinian's military machine. Belisarius demonstrated exceptional defensive skills, utilising the city's ancient walls and organising effective sorties against Gothic positions. His engineers repaired aqueducts damaged by the besiegers and maintained food supplies through careful rationing and occasional relief convoys. The Gothic army, estimated at 150,000 men, surrounded the city with elaborate siege works, including massive wooden towers and catapults designed to breach the walls. The siege's turning point came when Belisarius launched a series of coordinated attacks against Gothic camps, utilising his cavalry's superior mobility and the devastating firepower of Hun archers. The Gothic forces, weakened by disease and supply shortages, gradually abandoned their positions. Vitiges lifted the siege in March 538 CE, retreating northward to Ravenna, the Gothic capital. The Italian campaign's complexity increased dramatically with the arrival of Narses, an elderly Armenian eunuch who served as Justinian's chief treasurer and military coordinator. Tensions between Belisarius and Narses over command authority hampered military operations, while Gothic resistance stiffened under new leadership. The war evolved into a prolonged conflict, characterised by siege warfare, guerrilla tactics, and shifting alliances among Italian populations caught between competing powers. The Gothic War's final phase witnessed the emergence of Totila, an energetic Gothic king who reversed many Byzantine gains through aggressive campaigning and skillful propaganda. Totila's forces recaptured Rome in 546 CE, forcing Belisarius to conduct a difficult defensive campaign with limited resources. The war's devastation was immense, with contemporary sources describing widespread destruction, population displacement, and economic collapse throughout the Italian peninsula. Justinian's Spanish campaign represented the most limited of his western reconquests, targeting the Visigothic kingdom during a period of internal weakness. A succession crisis following King Agila's death in 554 CE provided an opportunity for intervention, with one faction requesting Byzantine assistance against their rivals. A small expeditionary force under Liberius established a foothold in southeastern Spain, capturing Cartagena and other coastal cities. The Spanish territories remained a peripheral concern for Justinian, who allocated minimal resources to their defence and administration. The Byzantine presence in Spain, concentrated in the coastal regions of Cartagena and Malaga, served primarily as a naval base for Mediterranean operations, rather than a serious attempt at territorial conquest. These holdings would prove difficult to maintain and would be gradually lost to Visigothic counterattacks in subsequent decades. The military campaign's enormous costs strained imperial finances and required unprecedented levels of taxation throughout the empire. Justinian's wars consumed an estimated £65,000 of gold annually, equivalent to the entire regular imperial budget of previous centuries. The emperor's tax collectors, led by the notorious John of Cappadocia, implemented harsh collection methods that generated widespread resentment among the population. Parallel to his military campaigns, Justinian undertook the most comprehensive legal reform in Roman history, creating the Corpus Juris Civilis that would influence European legal systems for over a millennium. The emperor appointed a commission led by Tribonian, a brilliant jurist from Pamphylia, to compile and systematize the vast accumulation of Roman legal precedents, imperial constitutions, and juristic writings that had developed over centuries. The legal compilation project began in 528 CE with the creation of the Codex Justinianus, which organized imperial constitutions issued since Hadrian's reign. This initial code contained 4,652 laws arranged in 12 books covering topics from ecclesiastical law to criminal procedure. The Commission's work required extensive editing and revision, as many earlier laws contradicted each other or had become obsolete through changed circumstances. The digest, completed in 533 CE, represented the project's most ambitious component, condensing the writings of classical Roman jurists into 50 books containing over 9,000 excerpts. Tribonian's commission examined approximately 2,000 legal works, selecting and editing passages that remained relevant to contemporary legal practice. The digest's organisation followed a logical progression from general principles to specific applications, creating a comprehensive legal encyclopedia that addressed virtually every aspect of civil law. The institutes, published simultaneously with the digest, served as an introductory textbook for law students, presenting fundamental legal principles in accessible language. This four-book compilation drew heavily from the 2nd century Juris Gaius, while incorporating Justinian's modifications and additions. The Institute's pedagogical approach made complex legal concepts understandable to beginning students while maintaining scholarly rigour. The Novelli, constitutions issued after 534 CE, addressed contemporary legal issues and modified earlier provisions as circumstances required. These new laws, written primarily in Greek rather than Latin, reflected the empire's linguistic evolution and addressed practical problems arising from Justinian's military campaigns and administrative reforms. The legal code's influence extended far beyond the Byzantine Empire, providing the foundation for medieval European legal education and jurisprudence. The Corpus Juris Civilis preserved classical Roman legal principles while adapting them to Christian moral teachings and contemporary administrative needs. Universities throughout Western Europe adopted Justinian's compilation as their primary legal text, ensuring its continued influence on legal development. The code's impact on Byzantine governance was immediate and profound. Imperial administration became more systematic and predictable, with clear procedures for legal proceedings and administrative decisions. The compilation's emphasis on imperial authority reinforced autocratic governance, while providing legal protections for subjects against arbitrary official actions. Justinian's architectural achievements rivaled his military and legal accomplishments, transforming Constantinople into a magnificent imperial capital that proclaimed Byzantine power and Christian faith. The emperor's building program encompassed churches, palaces, fortifications, and public works throughout the empire, but his greatest achievement was the reconstruction of Hagia Sophia following its destruction during the Nika riots of 532 CE. The new Hagia Sophia, designed by Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, represented a revolutionary architectural achievement that combined Roman engineering techniques with innovative structural solutions. The building's central dome, spanning 107 feet in diameter and rising 180 feet above the floor, created an unprecedented sense of soaring space that contemporaries described as hanging from heaven by a golden chain. The architect's solution to supporting the massive dome involved a complex system of pendentives, curved triangular sections that transferred the dome's weight to 4 massive piers. This structural innovation allowed the creation of a vast, unobstructed interior space that could accommodate thousands of worshippers while maintaining perfect acoustics for liturgical ceremonies. The church's interior decoration reflected the full splendour of Byzantine artistic achievement, with millions of gold and coloured glass tesserae creating shimmering mosaics that transform the building's surfaces into ethereal visions of divine glory. The altar area featured a magnificent ciborium supported by silver columns, while the ambo was crafted from precious metals and decorated with intricate reliefs depicting biblical scenes. The Hagia Sophia's construction required unprecedented resources and organisational capabilities. Contemporary sources record that 10,000 workers laboured on the project, with materials transported from throughout the empire and beyond. Columns were removed from ancient temples in Ephesus and Baalbek, while marble came from quarries in Proconnesus and Thessaly. The building's completion in 537 CE marked the culmination of late Roman architectural achievement. Justinian's patronage extended to numerous other architectural projects throughout the empire. The Church of Saints Sergius and Bacchus in Constantinople, built simultaneously with Hagia Sophia, served as an experimental prototype for the larger church's innovative design. The emperor also commissioned extensive fortifications, including the renovation of Constantinople's land walls and the construction of new defensive systems in recently conquered territories. The cultural flowering of Justinian's reign encompassed literature, art, and intellectual life throughout the empire. The emperor's court attracted scholars, poets, and artists from across the Mediterranean world, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual environment that fostered creative achievement. The historian Procopius produced his comprehensive account of Justinian's wars, while the poet Corpus celebrated imperial victories in elaborate verses that combined classical literary techniques with Christian themes. Byzantine art during this period achieved new levels of sophistication and symbolic complexity. Mosaic artists developed techniques for creating increasingly realistic human figures while maintaining the spiritual otherworldliness that characterized Christian art. The famous mosaic portraits of Justinian and Theodora in Ravenna's San Vitale demonstrate the period's artistic achievements, presenting the imperial couple with divine attributes while maintaining recognizable human characteristics. The empire's educational system experienced significant expansion during Justinian's reign, with new schools established in major cities and increased imperial support for higher learning. The University of Constantinople emerged as the empire's premier educational institution, attracting students from throughout the known world to study law, philosophy, and theology. The emperor's personal interest in theological questions stimulated scholarly debate and literary production among ecclesiastical writers. The devastating plague that struck the empire in 541 CE fundamentally altered the trajectory of Justinian's reign and the empire's future development. The pandemic, later known as the Plague of Justinian, originated in Egypt and spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world via established trade routes. The disease, likely bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, killed an estimated 25 to 30% of the empire's population over the following decades. Constantinople suffered particularly severe mortality, with contemporary sources describing daily death tolls reaching 10,000 at the epidemic's peak. The plague's impact on urban centres was catastrophic, as dense populations and poor sanitation facilitated rapid transmission. Procopius provided vivid descriptions of the disease's symptoms and social effects, noting that normal burial practices became impossible due to the overwhelming number of corpses. The plague's demographic impact had profound economic consequences throughout the empire. Agricultural production declined dramatically as rural populations were decimated, leading to food shortages and increased prices in urban markets. Tax revenues fell sharply, forcing the imperial government to reduce military expenditures and abandon planned construction projects. The empire's ability to maintain its expanded territories became increasingly questionable as manpower shortages affected both military recruitment and administrative functions. The pandemic's psychological impact on the population was equally significant, with many interpreting the catastrophe as divine punishment for imperial policies or theological errors. Religious movements promising salvation through extreme asceticism gained followers, while traditional social structures weakened under the stress of massive mortality. The plague's recurrence in subsequent decades prevented demographic recovery and maintained pressure on imperial resources. Justinian himself contracted the plague in 542 CE but recovered, though the experience appears to have affected his subsequent policies and priorities. The emperor's later years were marked by increased religious preoccupation and reduced military ambition, as the practical limitations imposed by demographic and economic decline became apparent. The dream of complete imperial restoration remained unfulfilled, as the empire struggled to maintain its existing territories against renewed barbarian pressures and Persian threats. The plague's long-term consequences extended far beyond Justinian's reign, fundamentally altering the empire's demographic structure and economic capabilities. The population decline reduced the tax base available for military and administrative expenses, while labour shortages drove up wages and production costs throughout the empire. These economic pressures would continue to influence imperial policy for centuries, contributing to the gradual abandonment of Western territories and the empire's transformation into a more compact, defensible state centred on Anatolia and the Balkans. The death of Justinian in 565 CE marked the end of an era of unprecedented ambition and expansion, but the empire he left behind faced mounting challenges that would test its very survival. The demographic catastrophe of the plague, combined with the enormous financial burden of maintaining distant conquests, had fundamentally weakened the imperial structure. As the 6th century drew to a close, the empire found itself confronting simultaneous threats from multiple directions. Persian armies pressed against the eastern frontier, Slavic tribes penetrated deep into the Balkans, and the recently conquered western territories required constant military attention to prevent their loss to resurgent barbarian kingdoms. The accession of focus in 602 CE through a military coup against Emperor Maurice represented a turning point toward the catastrophic conflicts that would define the early 7th century. Phocas, a centurion of humble origins with a reputation for exceptional cruelty, had led a mutiny among troops stationed along the Danube frontier who had grown frustrated with Maurice's attempts to reduce military expenditures. The new emperor's reign was characterized by unprecedented brutality against perceived enemies, including the systematic persecution of aristocratic families and the execution of Maurice's children before their father's eyes. The Persian king Khosrow II seized upon the chaos surrounding Phocas's coup as justification for launching the most devastating war in the long history of Romano-Persian conflict. Claiming to avenge the murdered Maurice, who had previously provided him with military assistance to regain his throne, Khosrow assembled massive armies that would ultimately penetrate deeper into Roman territory than any Persian force since the 3rd century. The war that erupted in 603 CE would continue for over 2 decades, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Near East and leaving both empires exhausted and vulnerable to new threats. Persian forces achieved a series of stunning victories that stripped the empire of its most valuable eastern provinces. The fortress city of Dara, long considered the key to Mesopotamian defence, fell after a prolonged siege in 605 CE, opening the route into Syria. Antioch, the empire's 3rd largest city and administrative centre of the eastern provinces, was captured in 613 CE after its garrison was overwhelmed by Persian cavalry and siege engines. The loss of Antioch sent shockwaves throughout the empire, as the city had been considered virtually impregnable due to its massive walls and strategic position. The Persian advance continued with relentless momentum, as Khosrow's generals exploited the empire's internal divisions and military weaknesses. Damascus fell in 613 CE, followed by the systematic conquest of Palestine, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in 614 CE. The siege of Jerusalem proved particularly devastating, with Persian forces and their Jewish allies massacring thousands of Christian inhabitants and destroying numerous churches, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The capture of the True Cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, and its transport to Ctesiphon represented a profound symbolic defeat that resonated throughout the Christian world. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 619 CE delivered the most severe economic blow to the empire, depriving Constantinople of the grain supplies that had fed its population for centuries. Alexandria, the empire's 2nd largest city and centre of Mediterranean trade, surrendered after a brief siege, bringing Egypt's vast agricultural wealth under Persian control. The loss of Egyptian revenues combined with the destruction of Syrian and Palestinian tax bases reduced imperial income by an estimated 75%, forcing dramatic reductions in military expenditures and administrative functions. The empire's situation became increasingly desperate as Persian armies advanced into Anatolia, the heartland of imperial power. Chalcedon, directly across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, fell to Persian forces in 615 CE, allowing enemy troops to observe the imperial capital from across the narrow strait. The psychological impact of seeing Persian campfires burning within sight of the Great Palace was immense, as residents of Constantinople faced the real possibility that their city might fall to foreign conquest for the first time in its history. The overthrow of Phocis in 610 CE by Heraclius, son of the Exarch of Africa, provided the empire with new leadership at its moment of greatest crisis. Heraclius, a man of medium height with prematurely grey hair and penetrating blue eyes, possessed the military skills and strategic vision necessary to confront the empire's existential threats. His fleet had sailed from Carthage with a force of African troops and substantial financial resources, enabling him to organise effective resistance against both Persian invaders and domestic opponents. Heraclius' early years were consumed with desperate defensive measures as he struggled to prevent complete imperial collapse. The emperor personally led military campaigns against Persian forces in Anatolia, while simultaneously organising the defence of Constantinople against potential siege. His strategic approach emphasised mobility and rapid response, utilising the empire's remaining naval superiority to transport troops quickly between threatened sectors and maintain communication with isolated garrisons. The emperor's most crucial innovation was the development of the theme system, a revolutionary administrative and military organisation that would define Byzantine governance for centuries. Faced with the impossibility of maintaining professional armies through traditional taxation, Heraclius granted landholdings to soldier farmers who would provide military service in exchange for hereditary tenure. These military districts, called themes, combined civilian and military authority under a single commander responsible for both defence and administration. The theme system represented a fundamental departure from Roman administrative traditions, which had carefully separated military and civilian functions to prevent the concentration of power that might enable provincial revolts. The new system's effectiveness in frontier defence, however, outweighed these theoretical concerns, as theme commanders could respond rapidly to threats without waiting for orders from Constantinople. The Anatolic theme, established in the central highlands of Asia Minor, became the model for subsequent military districts throughout the empire. The transformation of military organisation extended beyond administrative structure to encompass recruitment, training, and tactical doctrine. The traditional Roman emphasis on heavy infantry formations proved inadequate against the mobile cavalry tactics employed by Persian and later Arab forces. Heraclius promoted the development of heavily armoured cavalry units, known as cataphracts, who could match enemy mobility while providing superior firepower through their composite bows and shock action with lance and sword. The emperor's military reforms also emphasised the importance of fortified positions and defensive strategies adapted to the empire's reduced territorial extent. Rather than attempting to defend long frontier lines with inadequate forces, the new system concentrated on holding key strongpoints that could serve as bases for counterattacks and refuges for civilian populations during enemy raids. This approach required extensive fortification construction and the development of sophisticated siege warfare techniques. The theological controversies that erupted during Heraclius's reign reflected the emperor's attempts to restore unity to territories recovered from Persian occupation while accommodating the diverse religious traditions of his subjects. The monothelite doctrine, which proposed that Christ possessed two natures but only one will, represented a compromise between Orthodox Chalcedonian Christianity and the monophysite beliefs prevalent in Syria and Egypt. Heraclius promoted this theological position through the ecthesis of 638 CE, hoping to reconcile religious differences that had facilitated Persian conquest. The monothelite controversy generated intense opposition from both Orthodox theologians and monophysite extremists, ultimately creating greater religious division rather than the unity Heraclius had sought. Pope Honorius initially supported the compromise doctrine, but his successors condemned monothelitism as heretical, creating a serious breach between Constantinople and Rome that would influence imperial relations with the West for decades. The theological dispute also provided ammunition for critics of imperial religious policy, weakening support for the government among both clergy and laity. The emperor's personal involvement in theological debates reflected the Byzantine conception of imperial authority as encompassing both temporal and spiritual responsibilities. Heraclius viewed himself as God's representative on earth, responsible for maintaining orthodox doctrine and protecting the Church from heretical innovations. This theological activism, while consistent with imperial tradition, created new vulnerabilities as religious opponents could challenge imperial policies on doctrinal grounds. The iconoclastic controversy that emerged in the early 8th century represented an even more fundamental challenge to traditional religious practices and imperial authority. The movement's origins lay in the military disasters that had befallen the empire, which some attributed to divine displeasure with the veneration of religious images. Emperor Leo III's initial iconoclastic measures in 726 CE, including the removal of the famous icon of Christ from the chalk gate of the Great Palace, provoked violent resistance from both clergy and laity. The iconoclastic policy created deep divisions within imperial society, as image veneration had become integral to popular religious practice. Monasteries, which served as centres of icon production and veneration, emerged as focal points of resistance to imperial policy. The destruction of religious artwork and the persecution of monks who refused to comply with iconoclastic decrees generated widespread resentment that undermined imperial authority and provided opportunities for political opposition. The relationship between iconoclasm and military effectiveness became a central argument in the controversy, with supporters claiming that the removal of idolatrous images would restore divine favour and ensure military victory. Critics countered that the persecution of traditional religious practices had actually weakened the empire by creating internal divisions and alienating potential allies. The debate's intensity reflected deeper questions about the nature of imperial authority and the relationship between church and state. The Arab conquests that began in the 630s presented the empire with its most serious external threat since the Persian Wars, as the newly unified Arabian tribes launched coordinated attacks against both Persian and Byzantine territories. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE marked the decisive moment in the struggle for Syria, as a massive Byzantine army under Theodore Tritherius was annihilated by Arab forces employing superior cavalry tactics and coordinated infantry assaults. The defeat opened Syria to complete Arab conquest and demonstrated the effectiveness of the new military organisation emerging from the Arabian Peninsula. The loss of Egypt to Arab forces in 641 CE completed the empire's transformation from a Mediterranean power controlling the sea's entire eastern basin to a truncated state centred on Anatolia and the Balkans. Alexandria's surrender after a prolonged siege ended over 9 centuries of Greco-Roman rule in Egypt, depriving the empire of revenues that had supported imperial expansion since the time of Augustus. The Arab conquest was facilitated by the cooperation of Coptic Christians, who viewed the new rulers as preferable to Byzantine religious persecution. The Arab advance into North Africa eliminated the last remnants of Justinian's western reconquests, as Carthage fell to Arab forces in 698 CE after a series of campaigns that gradually reduced Byzantine holdings to isolated coastal enclaves. The loss of North Africa severed the empire's connection to its Spanish territories, which were subsequently abandoned to Visigothic reconquest. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, became a contested frontier between Christian and Muslim powers. The Arab sieges of Constantinople in 674, 678 CE and 717, 718 CE tested the empire's ability to defend its capital against the most formidable military force of the age. The first siege involved a massive Arab fleet that established a blockade of the Golden Horn, while land forces invested the city's landward walls. The siege's duration of 4 years demonstrated both Arab determination and the effectiveness of Constantinople's defences, as the city's position on a peninsula surrounded by water made complete investment extremely difficult. The development of Greek fire proved crucial to Byzantine survival during these sieges, as the incendiary compound allowed imperial naval forces to destroy Arab ships with devastating effectiveness. The weapon's exact composition remains unknown, but contemporary sources describe a liquid fire that could not be extinguished by water and burned even on the sea's surface. The psychological impact of Greek fire was as important as its physical effects, as Arab crews became reluctant to approach Byzantine vessels equipped with the mysterious weapon. The second Arab siege of 717 CE represented the climactic moment in the struggle between the empire and the expanding Islamic world. The massive Arab army, estimated at over 100,000 men, was supported by a fleet of 1,800 ships that attempted to establish complete control over the Bosphorus and Golden Horn. Emperor Leo III's defensive preparations included the strengthening of the city's walls, the accumulation of food supplies, and the organisation of civilian populations for siege warfare. The siege's failure resulted from a combination of factors, including the severe winter of 718 CE, which decimated the Arab army through cold and disease, and the effective use of Greek fire against the enemy fleet. Bulgarian attacks on Arab supply lines further weakened the besieging forces, while the city's defenders maintained morale through effective leadership and religious inspiration. The Arab withdrawal in August 718 CE marked the end of serious Muslim attempts to capture Constantinople and establish the empire's survival as a major power in the eastern Mediterranean. The empire's survival through these catastrophic decades required fundamental changes in governmental structure, military organisation, and social relationships that would define Byzantine civilization for centuries to come. The theme system's development created a new class of soldier farmers whose military service was tied to land tenure, providing the empire with a reliable source of military manpower while reducing the financial burden of maintaining professional armies. This transformation represented a return to earlier Roman traditions of citizen soldiers, while adapting to the specific challenges of 7th and 8th century warfare. The brutal murder of Emperor Michael III in his bedchamber by his trusted companion Basil the Macedonian in September 867 CE marked the beginning of the most glorious period in Byzantine history. Basil, a peasant from the theme of Macedonia, who had risen through his physical prowess and cunning to become the emperor's favourite, seized the throne through an act of calculated betrayal that would paradoxically usher in nearly 2 centuries of unprecedented military success and cultural achievement. The new emperor, standing tall and powerfully built with dark hair and penetrating eyes, possessed the ruthless determination necessary to restore the empire's fortunes after decades of military setbacks and internal strife. The establishment of the Macedonian dynasty represented more than a simple change of rulers. It marked the emergence of a new imperial ideology that combined military aggression with cultural sophistication. Basil I, despite his humble origins and violent path to power, understood that lasting imperial success required both military strength and intellectual legitimacy. His court attracted scholars, artists, and theologians who would transform Constantinople into the undisputed centre of Eastern Christian civilization, while his armies began the systematic reconquest of territories lost to Arab expansion in the previous centuries. The military revival under Basil first began with comprehensive reforms to the theme system that had evolved during the dark ages of the 7th and 8th centuries. The emperor recognised that the empire's survival depended on maintaining professional military forces capable of conducting offensive operations, rather than merely defending existing territories. He increased the size of the tagmata, the central imperial regiment stationed around Constantinople, while improving their equipment and training to create elite units capable of spearheading major campaigns. The reorganisation of the imperial navy proved equally crucial to the empire's renewed military effectiveness. Basil invested heavily in shipbuilding programs that produced vessels equipped with improved versions of Greek fire and manned by experienced crews drawn from the maritime themes of the Aegean islands. The new fleet's capabilities were demonstrated in successful operations against Arab pirates, who had long disrupted Mediterranean trade routes, restoring Byzantine control over crucial sea lanes that connected the capital to its remaining territories. The emperor's military campaigns focused initially on the reconquest of southern Italy, where Arab forces had established footholds in Sicily and Calabria that threatened Byzantine control over the peninsula's remaining Greek-speaking regions. The appointment of Nicephorus Phocas the Elder as strategos of the Italian themes brought exceptional military leadership to the region, as this experienced general possessed both tactical brilliance and the administrative skills necessary to coordinate complex amphibious operations across the Mediterranean. The Italian campaigns revealed the effectiveness of the reformed Byzantine military machine, as imperial forces demonstrated superior discipline and coordination compared to their Arab opponents. The recapture of Bari in 876 CE after a prolonged siege eliminated the last major Arab stronghold in mainland Italy, while successful naval operations disrupted enemy supply lines and prevented reinforcements from reaching besieged garrisons. These victories restored Byzantine prestige throughout the Mediterranean world and demonstrated that the empire had recovered from the devastating losses of the previous 2 centuries. The resolution of the iconoclastic controversy during Basil's reign represented a fundamental turning point in Byzantine religious and cultural life. The emperor's support for the restoration of icon veneration, formalised through the actions of Patriarch Photius and later confirmed by the Council of 869, 870 CE ended over a century of religious conflict that had divided imperial society and weakened the empire's unity. The restoration of religious images to churches throughout the empire unleashed a tremendous burst of artistic creativity as craftsmen and artists sought to replace the works destroyed during the iconoclastic period. The cultural renaissance that followed the end of iconoclasm manifested itself in numerous forms of artistic and intellectual achievement. The reconstruction of the Hagia Sophia's interior decoration involved the creation of magnificent mosaics that combined traditional Byzantine techniques with new artistic innovations reflecting the empire's renewed confidence. The famous mosaic of the Virgin and Child in the church's apse, completed during this period, demonstrated the sophisticated theological symbolism and artistic skill that characterized the Macedonian Renaissance. The revival of manuscript illumination represented another crucial aspect of the cultural flowering, as scriptoriums throughout the empire produced elaborately decorated books that preserved classical texts while creating new works of Christian theology and imperial history. The Paris Psalter, created for imperial use during this period, exemplified the fusion of classical artistic traditions with Christian themes that defined Byzantine cultural achievement. These manuscripts served not only as religious and literary works, but also as vehicles for displaying imperial wealth and sophistication to foreign visitors and domestic audiences. The expansion of Byzantine influence in the Balkans during the Macedonian period represented one of the empire's most significant achievements, as successive emperors systematically extended imperial control over Slavic populations that had settled in the region during the previous centuries. The conversion of the Bulgarian Khan Boris first to Christianity in 864 CE marked the beginning of a process that would ultimately bring the entire Balkan Peninsula under Byzantine cultural and religious influence, even when political control remained contested. The mission of Saints Cyril and Methodius to Great Moravia in 863 CE, undertaken at the request of Prince Rastislav, demonstrated the empire's sophisticated approach to cultural expansion through religious conversion and linguistic adaptation. Constantine and his brother Methodius, both learned theologians from Thessalonica with extensive knowledge of Slavic languages, created the first written alphabet for Slavic peoples, enabling the translation of Christian liturgy and scripture into vernacular languages that local populations could understand. The development of the Cyrillic alphabet represented a revolutionary innovation in medieval education and cultural transmission, as it provided Slavic peoples with the tools necessary for developing their own literary traditions while maintaining connection to Byzantine Christian civilization. The alphabet's design, based on Greek letters but adapted to accommodate the phonetic requirements of Slavic languages, demonstrated the intellectual sophistication of Byzantine scholars and their ability to adapt classical learning to contemporary needs. The impact of the Cyrillic alphabet extended far beyond its immediate religious applications, as it enabled the creation of legal codes, historical chronicles, and literary works that preserved Slavic cultural traditions while incorporating Byzantine political and religious concepts. The translation of Byzantine law codes into Slavic languages facilitated the spread of Roman legal principles throughout Eastern Europe, creating a common legal framework that would influence the region's development for centuries. The military campaigns of Basil I's successors, particularly Leo VI the Wise and Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, continued the systematic expansion of Byzantine power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The reconquest of Cyprus from Arab control in 965 CE under Nicephorus' second focus represented a crucial strategic victory that restored Byzantine naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean, while providing a forward base for operations against Arab territories in Syria and Palestine. The Cyprus campaign demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that the empire had developed during the Macedonian period, as the invasion force required coordination between naval and land units operating across hundreds of miles of open water. The successful siege of Famagusta and other fortified positions on the island revealed the effectiveness of Byzantine siege warfare techniques, which combined traditional Roman engineering skills with innovations adapted from Arab military practices. The reconquest of Crete in 961 CE under Nicephorus Phocas represented the culmination of decades of military preparation and strategic planning. The island had remained under Arab control since its conquest in 827 CE, serving as a base for piratical raids that disrupted Byzantine commerce and threatened the security of the Aegean islands. The campaign's success required the assembly of a massive fleet carrying over 50,000 troops, along with siege engines and supplies necessary for a prolonged campaign against heavily fortified positions. The siege of Chandax, Crete's principal city and the centre of Arab resistance, lasted for over 8 months and tested the limits of Byzantine military capabilities. The city's massive walls, reinforced with towers and protected by a deep moat, required the deployment of sophisticated siege equipment, including stone-throwing catapults and mobile towers that allowed attackers to reach the wall's top. The final assault in March 961 CE involved coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with Byzantine forces overwhelming the defenders through superior numbers and disciplined tactics. The success of the Cretan campaign had profound implications for Byzantine power throughout the Mediterranean, as it eliminated the last major Arab naval base in the Aegean Sea and restored imperial control over crucial trade routes connecting Constantinople to southern Italy and the Black Sea regions. The island's reconquest also provided the empire with substantial booty, including thousands of prisoners who were sold into slavery and vast quantities of gold and silver that helped finance subsequent military campaigns. The expansion of Byzantine power into Syria and Mesopotamia during the reign of Nicephorus, Second Phocas and John I Zimisces represented the empire's most ambitious military undertaking since the age of Justinian. The systematic conquest of Cilicia and northern Syria between 962 and 969 CE restored imperial control over territories that had been lost to Arab expansion 3 centuries earlier, while providing forward bases for potential attacks against the Islamic heartland. The capture of Antioch in 969 CE marked the symbolic climax of Byzantine military revival, as the city had served as the administrative centre of Arab power in northern Syria and possessed enormous strategic and economic importance. The siege required months of careful preparation, including the construction of massive siege engines and the coordination of multiple army corps operating across difficult terrain. The city's fall sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and demonstrated that the Byzantine Empire had recovered its position as a major military power. The military successes of the Macedonian period were accompanied by significant administrative and legal reforms that strengthened imperial governance and improved the efficiency of provincial administration. The Basilica, a comprehensive legal code completed during the reign of Leo VI, represented a systematic revision of Justinian's legal compilation adapted to the changed circumstances of the medieval empire. The new code eliminated obsolete provisions while incorporating centuries of legal precedent and imperial legislation into a coherent framework. The development of the Book of the Eparch during this period revealed the sophisticated commercial regulations that governed Constantinople's economic life, as the imperial government sought to maintain control over trade guilds, while encouraging commercial activity that generated tax revenues. The regulations covered everything from bread production to silk weaving, demonstrating the detailed level of governmental oversight that characterized Byzantine administration. The reign of Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025 CE, represented the absolute zenith of Byzantine power and the culmination of the Macedonian Renaissance. Known to history as the Bulgar Slayer, Basil possessed the military genius and ruthless determination necessary to complete the empire's territorial expansion, while crushing internal opposition that threatened imperial unity. Standing of medium height with a full beard and intense dark eyes, the emperor was known for his simple lifestyle and complete dedication to military campaigning. The Bulgarian wars that consumed much of Basil's reign demonstrated both the empire's military capabilities and the emperor's personal commitment to expanding imperial territory. The conflict began with the rebellion of Samuel of Bulgaria, who had established an independent Bulgarian state in the Western Balkans and threatened Byzantine control over Macedonia and northern Greece. The war's duration, lasting from 986 to 1018 CE, reflected the difficulty of conquering mountainous terrain defended by determined opponents familiar with local conditions. The Battle of Kleivion in 1014 CE marked the decisive moment in the Bulgarian conflict, as Basil's forces surrounded and annihilated Samuel's army in a narrow mountain pass. The emperor's treatment of the 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners captured in the battle demonstrated his ruthless approach to warfare, as he ordered their eyes put out, leaving only one man in each 100 with a single eye to guide the others home. The psychological impact of this brutal act was immense, as Samuel reportedly died of shock upon seeing his blinded warriors return to his capital. The complete conquest of Bulgaria by 1018 CE extended Byzantine control to the Danube River and incorporated vast territories that had remained outside imperial authority for centuries. The integration of Bulgarian nobles into the Byzantine administrative system, combined with the preservation of local customs and the Bulgarian Church's autonomy, demonstrated the empire's sophisticated approach to governing diverse populations while maintaining central control. The empire's dominance in the eastern Mediterranean during Basil's reign was reflected in its control over crucial trade routes that connected Europe to Asia and Africa. Byzantine merchants operated throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, while the imperial navy maintained security for commercial vessels against piratical attacks. The empire's economic prosperity during this period supported military campaigns while funding the construction projects and artistic patronage that characterized the Macedonian Renaissance. The development of diplomatic relations with emerging European powers revealed the empire's continued importance in international affairs, despite its territorial losses in the West. The marriage alliance between Basil's sister Anna and Vladimir I of Kiev in 988 CE facilitated the conversion of the Kievan Rus to Orthodox Christianity, extending Byzantine cultural influence throughout Eastern Europe. The agreement required Vladimir to provide military assistance to Basil during the civil war against Bardas Phocas, demonstrating the practical benefits of diplomatic marriages. The cultural achievements of the Macedonian period extended beyond artistic and literary production to encompass significant advances in education and scholarship. The University of Constantinople experienced a remarkable revival under imperial patronage, attracting students from throughout the known world to study philosophy, theology, and law. The preservation and copying of classical texts during this period ensured the survival of ancient Greek literature and philosophy that might otherwise have been lost during the medieval period. The encyclopedic works produced during the Macedonian Renaissance, including the Pseudo-lexicon and various collections of classical excerpts, demonstrated the period's scholarly achievements and the empire's role in preserving ancient learning. These compilations served both educational and cultural purposes, providing students with access to classical knowledge while displaying the empire's intellectual sophistication to foreign visitors and domestic audiences. The death of Basil II in December 1025 marked the end of the Macedonian dynasty's golden age and the beginning of a period of unprecedented challenges that would fundamentally alter the empire's position in the medieval world. The emperor's passing without a male heir left the throne to his brother Constantine VIII, an elderly man more interested in court ceremonies than military campaigns. Constantine's brief reign of 3 years was characterized by the systematic dismantling of the military policies that had made Basil's conquest possible, as the new emperor reduced army expenditures and allowed the theme system's discipline to deteriorate in favour of increased court spending and bureaucratic expansion. The succession crisis that followed Constantine's death in 1028 revealed the fundamental weakness of an imperial system that had become increasingly dependent on the personal capabilities of individual rulers. The throne passed to Zoe, Constantine's daughter, who married Romanos III Argyros, a member of the civil aristocracy whose administrative experience could not compensate for his complete lack of military knowledge. The new emperor's attempts to personally lead campaigns against Arab forces in Syria ended in humiliating defeats that demonstrated the empire's declining military effectiveness and encouraged further enemy aggression. The growing tension between the military aristocracy and the civil bureaucracy became increasingly apparent during the reigns of Zoe's successive husbands, as court officials sought to reduce the power and influence of the provincial military commanders, who had dominated imperial policy under the Macedonian emperors. The civil aristocracy, centred in Constantinople and drawing its wealth from trade and taxation, rather than military service, viewed the theme system's military landholders as potential threats to central authority and sought to replace them with appointed officials responsible directly to the imperial government. This fundamental conflict over the nature of imperial governance manifested itself in disputes over military recruitment, taxation policies, and the allocation of resources between frontier defence and court expenditures. The civil bureaucracy's preference for negotiated settlements over military confrontation reflected both their lack of military experience and their concern that successful generals might use their victories to challenge imperial authority. The military aristocracy, concentrated in the Anatolian themes and drawing their identity from centuries of frontier warfare, viewed these policies as betrayals of imperial tradition and threats to the empire's survival. The deterioration of the theme system under civil bureaucratic management had immediate consequences for the empire's military effectiveness. The soldier farmers who had formed the backbone of Byzantine armies for centuries found their land tenure increasingly insecure as court officials sought to convert military holdings into tax-paying civilian properties. The reduction in military service obligations, initially welcomed by theme populations, ultimately weakened the empire's ability to respond rapidly to external threats and forced increased reliance on expensive mercenary forces. The empire's relationship with the Western Church had been deteriorating steadily since the Phocian Schism of the 9th century, but the underlying theological and political differences reached a crisis point during the Patriarchate of Michael Cerularius, who assumed office in 1043. Cerularius, a former civil servant who had entered the church after being implicated in a conspiracy against Constantine IX, possessed an uncompromising personality and deep conviction that the Eastern Church's traditions were superior to Western innovations. His aggressive defence of Eastern practices brought him into direct conflict with papal claims to universal jurisdiction over Christian churches. The immediate cause of the 1054 schism lay in disputes over liturgical practices and ecclesiastical authority that had been simmering for decades. The use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, mandatory celibacy for priests, and the addition of the Filioque clause to the Nicene Creed represented fundamental differences in theological understanding and church governance that could not be resolved through diplomatic compromise. Cerularius's closure of Latin churches in Constantinople and his public criticism of Western practices provided Pope Leo IX with justification for sending a papal delegation to demand the Patriarch's submission to Roman authority. The papal legates, led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, arrived in Constantinople in April 1054 with instructions to secure the Patriarch's acknowledgement of papal supremacy or face excommunication. Humbert, a man of rigid temperament and limited diplomatic skills, possessed neither the theological sophistication nor the cultural sensitivity necessary to navigate the complex ecclesiastical politics of the Byzantine court. His confrontational approach and public criticism of Eastern practices alienated potential supporters and strengthened Cerularius's position among the Constantinople clergy. The dramatic confrontation in the Hagia Sophia on July 16, 1054, when Humbert placed a bull of excommunication on the high altar during the celebration of the Divine Liturgy, marked the formal beginning of the great schism that would divide Christianity for centuries. The cardinal's action, performed in the presence of shocked worshippers and clergy, represented an unprecedented assault on the dignity of the Eastern Church and the authority of the ecumenical patriarch. Cerularius's response, burning the papal bull and excommunicating the legates in return, completed the mutual anathemas that formalized the break between Eastern and Western Christianity. The immediate consequences of the schism extended far beyond theological disputes to encompass fundamental changes in the empire's diplomatic position and military alliances. The break with Rome eliminated the possibility of Western military assistance against Islamic expansion, while providing the papacy with justification for supporting the empire's enemies in Italy and the Balkans. The Norman conquest of Byzantine territories in southern Italy gained papal blessing as a crusade against schismatic Greeks, transforming what had been a territorial dispute into a religious war. The rise of the Seljuk Turks in the mid-11th century presented the empire with its most serious military challenge since the Arab conquests of the 7th century. The Seljuks, a branch of the Oghuz Turkish confederation that had migrated westward from Central Asia, possessed superior cavalry tactics and a unified command structure that contrasted sharply with the fragmented Arab emirates that had previously threatened Byzantine territories. Their conversion to Sunni Islam provided them with religious legitimacy and support from the Abbasid Caliphate, while their nomadic origins gave them mobility and endurance that settled populations could not match. The Seljuk conquest of Baghdad in 1055 under Tugril Beg established Turkish control over the Islamic world's political centre and provided the resources necessary for expansion into Byzantine territories. The new rulers' adoption of the title Sultan and their recognition as protectors of the Caliph gave them authority over the fragmented emirates that had previously raided Byzantine frontiers independently. The unification of Islamic military forces under Seljuk leadership transformed sporadic border conflicts into systematic campaigns aimed at permanent territorial conquest. The initial Seljuk raids into Anatolia during the 1050s revealed the empire's military weaknesses and the inadequacy of theme system defences against highly mobile cavalry forces. The Turkish tactics of rapid advance, devastating raids against civilian populations, and quick withdrawal before Byzantine forces could respond effectively neutralised the static defence strategies that had proven successful against Arab armies. The theme militias, trained for local defence and lacking the mobility necessary to pursue retreating enemies, proved incapable of preventing the systematic destruction of Anatolian agriculture and the displacement of Christian populations. The Battle of Manzikert on August 26, 1071, represented the catastrophic culmination of Byzantine military decline and the beginning of permanent Turkish settlement in Anatolia. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, a capable military commander who had married into the imperial family and assumed the throne in 1068, assembled the largest Byzantine army in decades for a decisive campaign against Sultan Alp Arslan. The imperial force, estimated at 40,000 men, included the elite Tagmata regiments, theme militias from across Anatolia, and substantial contingents of foreign mercenaries, including Norman cavalry and Rus infantry. The campaign's initial phase proceeded successfully, as Byzantine forces captured several Turkish-held fortresses and advanced deep into Armenian territory. The emperor's decision to divide his army for simultaneous operations against multiple targets, however, created vulnerabilities that the experienced Turkish commanders quickly exploited. The detachment of substantial forces under Basilikes to capture Kliat weakened the main army while extending supply lines across difficult terrain that favoured Turkish mobility. The encounter at Manzikert began as a reconnaissance in force rather than a planned battle, as both armies sought to determine enemy positions and intentions. The Turkish vanguard's contact with Byzantine scouts escalated into a general engagement when Romanos ordered his entire army forward to exploit what appeared to be a Turkish retreat. The emperor's tactical plan called for a coordinated advance by heavy cavalry in the centre supported by infantry formations on the flanks, a formation that had proven effective in previous campaigns against Arab forces. The battle's decisive moment came when rumours spread through the Byzantine ranks that the emperor had been killed or captured, causing panic among troops who had been steadily advancing against Turkish positions. The source of these rumours remains unclear, but their impact was immediate and devastating as units began withdrawing without orders, creating gaps in the formation that Turkish cavalry exploited with devastating effectiveness. The emperor's capture, while attempting to rally his retreating forces, completed the army's disintegration and left thousands of Byzantine soldiers dead or captured on the battlefield. The immediate aftermath of Manzikert was even more catastrophic than the battle itself. As the empire's military collapse opened Anatolia to unrestricted Turkish settlement, the capture of the emperor, while providing Alp Arslan with a valuable bargaining chip, eliminated central coordination of defensive efforts and encouraged provincial commanders to negotiate separate agreements with Turkish leaders. The ransom terms agreed upon by Romanos, including the payment of 1.5 million gold pieces and the cession of several frontier fortresses, exceeded the empire's financial capabilities and required crushing taxation that further weakened imperial authority. The civil war that erupted following Romanos's return from captivity in 1072 completed the destruction of Byzantine military power in Anatolia. The Ducas family's opposition to the emperor's military policies and their successful coup against him eliminated the last effective resistance to Turkish expansion, while providing Turkish commanders with opportunities to intervene in Byzantine internal conflicts. The rival claimants' willingness to employ Turkish mercenaries against each other legitimized the Turkish presence in Anatolia and provided them with detailed knowledge of Byzantine defensive weaknesses. The systematic Turkish conquest of Anatolia proceeded with remarkable speed, as nomadic tribes occupied abandoned agricultural lands and established permanent settlements in regions that had been Christian for over 7 centuries. The city of Nicaea, located only 60 miles from Constantinople, fell to Turkish forces in 1078, providing them with a major administrative centre and forward base for potential attacks on the capital itself. The loss of Nicaea had profound psychological impact throughout the empire, as the city had been the site of the First Ecumenical Council and represented the heartland of Byzantine Christianity. The transformation of Anatolia from a Christian to a Muslim region involved not only military conquest but also systematic cultural and religious change. The Turkish settlers' pastoral lifestyle disrupted the agricultural economy that had supported Byzantine civilization, while the construction of mosques and madrasas in former Christian cities symbolized the permanent nature of the conquest. The migration of Christian populations to Constantinople and other remaining Byzantine territories created refugee problems that strained imperial resources and reduced tax revenues from depopulated regions. The Norman conquest of Byzantine territories in southern Italy proceeded simultaneously with the Turkish advance in Anatolia, creating a two-front crisis that exceeded the empire's military capabilities. The Norman adventurers, who had initially served as mercenaries in Italian conflicts, gradually established independent principalities that challenged both papal and Byzantine authority. Robert Guiscard's systematic conquest of Apulia and Calabria between 1057 and 1071 eliminated the last Byzantine strongholds in mainland Italy and provided the Normans with resources for expansion into Sicily and the Balkans. The siege of Bari in 1068 to 1071 marked the end of Byzantine rule in Italy after over 5 centuries of imperial presence in the peninsula. The city's massive fortifications, constructed during the Macedonian period to serve as the administrative centre of the Catapanate of Italy, proved inadequate against Norman siege techniques and the systematic blockade that prevented relief from Constantinople. The fall of Bari eliminated the empire's last major naval base in the western Mediterranean and ended any possibility of recovering the Italian territories that had been conquered by Justinian. The Norman success in Italy demonstrated the effectiveness of Western military innovations, particularly the use of heavy cavalry and castle construction techniques that provided secure bases for territorial conquest. The Norman knights' tactical superiority over Byzantine forces reflected both their superior equipment and their adaptation of military techniques developed during centuries of warfare in Western Europe. The construction of stone castles throughout conquered territories provided the Normans with defensive positions that could be held with minimal garrisons while serving as bases for further expansion. The empire's relationship with Venice underwent fundamental changes during this period, as the Maritime Republic exploited Byzantine weakness to secure commercial privileges that would dominate Eastern Mediterranean trade for centuries. The Golden Bull of 1082, issued by Emperor Alexios I, in exchange for Venetian naval assistance against the Normans, granted Venetian merchants unprecedented trading rights throughout the empire while exempting them from the customs duties that burdened other foreign traders. This agreement marked the beginning of Venetian commercial dominance in Byzantine markets and the gradual displacement of indigenous merchants by foreign competitors. The Venetian commercial privileges had profound long-term consequences for the empire's economic development, as they created unfair competition that undermined local industries and reduced imperial tax revenues. The exemption from customs duties allowed Venetian merchants to undersell Byzantine competitors while accumulating profits that were invested in further expansion of Venetian commercial networks. The agreement's terms also granted Venice extraterritorial jurisdiction over its citizens within the empire, creating a precedent for foreign legal autonomy that would be exploited by other Italian maritime republics. The political instability that characterized the period between 1025 and 1081 reflected fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system that had been masked by the personal capabilities of strong rulers like Basil II. The rapid succession of emperors, many of whom gained power through marriage into the imperial family rather than military achievement, created uncertainty about succession procedures and encouraged ambitious generals to attempt coups. The civil bureaucracy's attempts to control military commanders through administrative restrictions and reduced funding created resentment among the army officers, whose loyalty was essential for imperial survival. The economic consequences of military disasters and internal conflicts severely weakened the empire's financial position and reduced its ability to fund effective defensive measures. The loss of Anatolia eliminated the tax revenues from the empire's most productive agricultural regions, while the costs of maintaining mercenary forces to replace the destroyed theme armies consumed resources that had previously funded construction projects and cultural patronage. The debasement of the gold solidus, the empire's principal currency, reflected the desperate financial situation and undermined confidence in imperial economic stability. The coronation of Alexios I Komnenos in the Hagia Sophia on April 4, 1081, marked the beginning of a new era in Byzantine history, though the empire he inherited bore little resemblance to the mighty state that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean under the Macedonian dynasty. The new emperor, a man of medium height with prematurely grey hair and intelligent dark eyes, faced challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser rulers. Turkish forces controlled most of Anatolia, and had established their capital at Nicaea, less than a day's march from Constantinople. Norman armies under Robert Guiscard threatened the empire's remaining Balkan territories, while Pecheneг tribes raided freely across the Danube frontier. The imperial treasury was virtually empty, the theme system lay in ruins, and the empire's military forces consisted largely of unreliable mercenaries whose loyalty depended entirely on regular payment. Alexios belonged to a military aristocratic family from Paphlagonia that had served the empire with distinction for generations. His uncle Isaac, first Komnenos, had briefly held the throne from 1057 to 1059, while his older brother John had commanded imperial forces against the Turks before his death in battle. The family's military traditions provided Alexios with both tactical knowledge and connections among the officer corps that proved crucial during his rise to power. His marriage to Irene Dukaina, a member of another prominent military family, strengthened his position among the Anatolian aristocracy, while providing access to the political networks necessary for successful governance. The emperor's first priority involved securing the empire's immediate survival against the Norman invasion of the Balkans. Robert Guiscard had assembled a formidable army of approximately 30,000 men, including Norman heavy cavalry, Italian infantry, and Saracen archers, supported by a fleet of 150 ships that controlled the Adriatic approaches to Byzantine territory. The Norman strategy called for the systematic conquest of the Western Balkans, beginning with the capture of Dyrrhachium, the empire's principal fortress controlling the Via Egnatia that connected Constantinople to the Adriatic coast. The siege of Dyrrhachium, which began in June 1081, tested the effectiveness of the city's massive fortifications against the latest Western siege techniques. The fortress, built on a rocky promontory overlooking the Adriatic, featured double walls reinforced with towers and protected by a deep moat carved from solid rock. The Norman siege engines, including massive stone-throwing trebuchets and mobile towers, represented technological advances that had been developed during decades of warfare in Western Europe. The siege's duration of 8 months demonstrated both the strength of Byzantine fortifications and the determination of Norman attackers. Alexios's relief army, assembled with desperate haste from the empire's remaining military resources, included approximately 20,000 men drawn from the surviving theme militias, the imperial Tagmata regiments, and substantial contingents of foreign mercenaries. The Varangian Guard, composed primarily of Anglo-Saxon refugees who had fled England after the Norman conquest, provided the army's most reliable infantry, while Turkish and Pecheneг cavalry offered the mobility necessary to counter Norman tactical advantages. The emperor's decision to personally lead the relief expedition reflected both his military experience and his understanding that defeat would likely result in the empire's complete collapse. The Battle of Dyrrhachium, on October 18, 1081, revealed the tactical superiority of Norman military innovations over traditional Byzantine formations. The Norman heavy cavalry, protected by mail armour and equipped with long lances, proved devastatingly effective against Byzantine infantry formations that had been designed to counter Arab and Turkish light cavalry. The famous charge of the Norman knights shattered the Byzantine centre, while the disciplined retreat of Norman infantry units drew pursuing Byzantine forces into carefully prepared ambushes. The emperor's personal courage in attempting to rally his fleeing troops could not compensate for the fundamental tactical disadvantages that his forces faced. The battle's aftermath demonstrated the fragility of the empire's military position, as the defeat eliminated the last effective field army available for the defence of the Balkans. The fall of Dyrrhachium opened the route to Thessalonica, the empire's second largest city, while Norman naval forces established control over the Adriatic coast. The systematic Norman advance towards Constantinople appeared unstoppable until Robert Guiscard's death from fever in 1085 ended the immediate threat and allowed Alexios to concentrate on the empire's other pressing challenges. The emperor's diplomatic initiatives during this crisis period revealed his sophisticated understanding of European politics and his willingness to seek assistance from unlikely sources. The alliance with Venice, formalised through the Golden Bull of 1082, provided the empire with naval support against the Normans, while granting the Venetians unprecedented commercial privileges throughout Byzantine territories. The agreement's terms, which exempted Venetian merchants from customs duties and granted them extraterritorial legal rights, represented a significant departure from traditional imperial policy, but reflected the desperate circumstances that forced such concessions. The Venetian naval intervention proved decisive in disrupting Norman supply lines and preventing the consolidation of their conquests in the Balkans. The Venetian fleet's attack on the Norman base at Corfu in 1084 eliminated a crucial staging area for further operations, while their control of Adriatic shipping routes prevented reinforcements from reaching Guiscard's forces. The commercial privileges granted to Venice, however, established a precedent for foreign economic penetration that would ultimately prove more damaging to the empire than the military threats it was designed to counter. The Turkish problem in Anatolia required different solutions, as military reconquest appeared impossible with the empire's limited resources. Alexios adopted a strategy of diplomatic divide and conquer, exploiting the fragmentation of Turkish authority following the death of Sultan Malik Shah in 1092. The emperor's negotiations with individual Turkish emirs, combined with carefully targeted military operations against isolated Turkish strongholds, gradually restored Byzantine control over the northwestern regions of Anatolia. The recapture of Nicaea in 1097, achieved through a combination of siege warfare and diplomatic agreements with the city's Turkish garrison, marked the beginning of limited territorial recovery. The emperor's most controversial decision involved his request for Western military assistance, conveyed through diplomatic missions to Pope Urban II and various European rulers. The imperial embassy to the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, led by the experienced diplomat John the Oxite, sought limited military aid to help restore Byzantine control over Anatolia. The emperor's letter to Urban, which described the sufferings of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule and requested assistance from Western knights, was intended to secure a manageable force of perhaps 10,000 professional soldiers who could serve under Byzantine command. The papal response exceeded all expectations and created consequences that Alexios had never anticipated. Urban's proclamation of the First Crusade at Clermont in November 1095 transformed the emperor's request for military assistance into a massive religious movement that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Pope's vision of a holy war to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control went far beyond the limited territorial objectives that Alexios had envisioned, while the promise of spiritual rewards attracted participants whose motivations differed dramatically from traditional mercenary service. The arrival of the People's Crusade under Peter the Hermit in 1096 provided Alexios with his first indication of the movement's uncontrollable nature. The ragged army of approximately 40,000 peasants, monks, and minor nobles that reached Constantinople bore little resemblance to the disciplined military force that the emperor had requested. Peter, a charismatic preacher from Amiens with wild hair and penetrating eyes, had gathered followers through emotional appeals rather than military planning, creating a mob that posed as much threat to Byzantine territories as to Turkish enemies. The emperor's handling of the People's Crusade demonstrated his diplomatic skills and practical understanding of crowd psychology. Rather than attempting to control the unruly mass, Alexios provided supplies and transportation across the Bosphorus to Anatolia, where Turkish forces quickly annihilated the unprepared crusaders at the Battle of Civitot in October 1096. The massacre eliminated a potential source of disorder within the empire while providing the Turks with a misleading impression of Western military capabilities. The arrival of the main crusading armies in 1097 presented Alexios with both unprecedented opportunities and dangerous challenges. The four principal armies, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and other prominent Western nobles, included approximately 60,000 men equipped with the latest military technology and experienced in European warfare. The Crusaders' siege capabilities, demonstrated during their capture of Nicaea, exceeded anything the empire could field, while their heavy cavalry provided tactical advantages that could prove decisive against Turkish forces. The emperor's negotiations with the crusading leaders revealed the fundamental differences in objectives and expectations that would complicate their relationship throughout the campaign. Alexios sought to recover former Byzantine territories in Anatolia and northern Syria, viewing the Crusaders as temporary allies who would return conquered lands to imperial control. The crusading nobles, however, intended to establish independent principalities in the east, following the feudal traditions of Western Europe rather than the centralized imperial system that characterized Byzantine governance. The oath of allegiance that Alexios extracted from most crusading leaders represented a diplomatic masterpiece that temporarily aligned Western and Byzantine interests while preserving the emperor's legal claims to recovered territories. The ceremony, conducted in the Great Palace with elaborate ritual designed to impress the Western nobles, required each leader to swear fealty to the emperor and promise to restore former imperial territories. Bohemond's initial refusal to take the oath, overcome only through a combination of threats and bribes, foreshadowed the conflicts that would emerge once the Crusaders achieved military success. The Siege of Nicaea demonstrated the effectiveness of Byzantine Crusader cooperation when their interests aligned. The emperor's provision of siege engines and naval support on Lake Ascanius, combined with the Crusaders' assault capabilities, forced the Turkish garrison to negotiate surrender terms directly with Byzantine representatives. The city's peaceful transfer to imperial control, achieved through secret negotiations that bypassed the crusading armies, provided Alexios with his first major territorial recovery, while demonstrating his ability to manipulate the Crusaders' military efforts for Byzantine advantage. The Crusaders' subsequent advance through Anatolia achieved remarkable success in restoring Byzantine control over territories that had been lost for decades. The victories at Dorylaeum and other engagements eliminated Turkish resistance throughout western Anatolia, while the systematic occupation of fortified positions provided secure bases for further operations. The emperor's decision to accompany the crusading armies with a substantial Byzantine force ensured that recovered territories would be properly garrisoned and administered according to imperial requirements. The Siege of Antioch, which began in October 1097, marked the beginning of the most serious conflicts between Alexios and the crusading leaders. The city's massive fortifications, built on a series of hills overlooking the Orontes River, had been strengthened by successive Muslim rulers and appeared virtually impregnable to direct assault. The siege's duration of over 8 months exhausted both sides, while the arrival of a relief army under Kaboga of Mosul threatened to trap the Crusaders between the city's garrison and external enemies. Bohemond's emergence as the siege's most effective leader, combined with his family's previous conflicts with the Byzantine Empire, created a dangerous situation for imperial interests. The Norman prince's tactical brilliance and political cunning made him indispensable to the Crusades' success, while his ambitions for independent rule in Antioch directly challenged the oath of allegiance he'd sworn to Alexios. The emperor's attempts to influence events through diplomatic missions and limited military support proved inadequate to prevent Bohemond's eventual seizure of the city. The controversy surrounding Alexios' withdrawal from the siege region in June 1098 reflected the fundamental misunderstandings that plagued Byzantine Crusader relations. The emperor's decision to retreat when informed of Kaboga's approach appeared logical from a Byzantine perspective, as preserving imperial forces took priority over supporting allies whose ultimate loyalty remained questionable. The Crusaders, however, interpreted the withdrawal as abandonment and used it to justify their subsequent refusal to honour territorial agreements. The Crusaders' miraculous victory over Kaboga's army and their successful defence of Antioch eliminated the immediate Turkish threat while establishing Western military dominance in northern Syria. Bohemon's claim to rule Antioch as an independent principality, supported by his fellow Crusaders, directly challenged imperial authority and created a precedent for Western territorial acquisitions in the east. The emperor's diplomatic protests and legal arguments proved ineffective against the reality of Western military occupation and the Crusaders' determination to establish permanent settlements. The establishment of the Crusader states represented a fundamental alteration of the Eastern Mediterranean's political landscape that would influence Byzantine policy for centuries. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, Principality of Antioch, County of Edessa, and County of Tripoli created a chain of Western-ruled territories that controlled crucial trade routes and strategic positions along the empire's southern frontier. The Crusaders' adoption of Western feudal institutions and legal systems created alien political structures that operated according to principles fundamentally different from Byzantine administrative traditions. The complex relationship between the empire and the Crusader states involved constant diplomatic maneuvering, military cooperation, and territorial disputes that reflected the fundamental incompatibility of their political systems. The Crusaders' need for Byzantine naval support and commercial access ensured continued interaction, while territorial disputes over cities like Antioch and Cilician Armenia created ongoing sources of conflict. The emperor's attempts to exploit divisions among the Crusader principalities through selective alliances and diplomatic interventions achieved limited success, but could not resolve the fundamental challenge that Western territorial expansion posed to imperial authority. The economic consequences of the crusading movement proved as significant as its military and political effects. The massive influx of Western pilgrims and settlers created new commercial opportunities while disrupting traditional trade patterns that had connected the empire to Asian markets. The Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, exploited the Crusaders' need for naval transport and supplies to establish permanent commercial networks throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The commercial privileges granted to these cities, initially intended as temporary wartime expedients, became permanent features of the regional economy that gradually displaced Byzantine merchants from their traditional markets. The Venetian quarter in Constantinople, established following the 1082 agreement, evolved into a virtually independent commercial enclave that operated according to Western legal principles rather than Byzantine regulations. The Venetians' exemption from customs duties and their extraterritorial legal rights created unfair competitive advantages that undermined local merchants while reducing imperial tax revenues. The expansion of similar privileges to other Italian cities during subsequent crises multiplied these economic disadvantages and contributed to the empire's gradual commercial subordination to Western interests. The military innovations introduced by the Crusaders had lasting effects on Byzantine tactical doctrine and equipment. The effectiveness of Western heavy cavalry against Turkish light cavalry tactics encouraged the adoption of similar formations within imperial armies, while the Crusaders' siege techniques provided models for improving Byzantine fortification and assault capabilities. The emperor's recruitment of Western knights as mercenaries, initially intended as a temporary expedient, evolved into a permanent feature of imperial military organization that gradually displaced traditional Byzantine units. The cultural and religious impact of increased Western presence in the Eastern Mediterranean created new sources of tension and misunderstanding between Greek and Latin Christians. The Crusaders' unfamiliarity with Eastern Christian practices and their tendency to view Byzantine rituals as heretical or superstitious generated conflicts that went beyond mere political disagreements. The Latin clergy's attempts to impose Western liturgical practices on Eastern Christian populations in the Crusader states created resentment that complicated diplomatic relations and reduced the possibility of genuine cooperation between the two branches of Christianity. The empire's relationship with the Italian maritime republics underwent fundamental changes as these cities exploited the crusading movement to establish permanent commercial dominance in eastern Mediterranean trade. The Genoese acquisition of commercial privileges in 1104, followed by similar agreements with Pisa and other Italian cities, create a competitive environment that systematically disadvantaged Byzantine merchants. The Italian cities' superior naval capabilities and financial resources, combined with their exemption from imperial taxation, enabled them to dominate the lucrative trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. The long-term consequences of Alexios's decision to request Western military assistance became increasingly apparent as the 12th century progressed. The establishment of permanent Western settlements in the east, the commercial penetration of Italian merchants, and the gradual erosion of imperial authority over traditional territories created challenges that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the Turkish threats they were intended to address. The emperor's immediate success in recovering portions of Anatolia and securing the empire's survival was achieved at the cost of fundamental changes in the eastern Mediterranean's political and economic structure that would eventually contribute to the empire's destruction. The death of Manuel I Komnenos in 1180 marked the beginning of a catastrophic decline that would culminate in the most devastating blow ever inflicted upon the Byzantine Empire. The emperor's ambitious foreign policy had overextended imperial resources, while his complex diplomatic maneuvers had created numerous enemies throughout the Mediterranean world. His successor, Alexios II, was merely 11 years old, leaving the empire under the regency of his mother Maria of Antioch, whose Western origins and reliance on Latin advisors generated intense resentment among the Constantinople aristocracy and populace. The regency crisis that followed Manuel's death revealed the deep fissures that had developed within Byzantine society during the Crusading era. The military aristocracy, represented by families like the Komnenos and Palaiologos clans, viewed the increasing Western influence at court as a betrayal of imperial traditions and a threat to their own political dominance. The civil bureaucracy, meanwhile, struggled to maintain administrative efficiency while managing the empire's deteriorating financial situation. The Italian merchants who had established permanent quarters in Constantinople wielded economic power that often exceeded that of imperial officials, creating a parallel authority structure that undermined traditional governance. The massacre of the Latins in Constantinople in May 1182 demonstrated the explosive potential of these accumulated tensions. The uprising, orchestrated by Andronikos I Komnenos in his bid for power, resulted in the systematic slaughter of thousands of Western merchants, clergy and residents who had settled in the capital over the previous century. The violence was particularly brutal in the Venetian quarter, where entire families were murdered and their property seized by mobs that had been inflamed by decades of resentment against foreign commercial privileges. The papal legate was beheaded, while the Latin patriarch was dragged through the streets and executed in a grotesque parody of religious ceremony. Andronikos' subsequent reign of terror eliminated potential rivals through a systematic campaign of executions, mutilations and confiscations that paralysed the imperial administration. The emperor, now in his 60s with a white beard and increasingly paranoid demeanour, had spent decades in exile plotting his return to power. His methods of governance relied on fear and spectacular violence designed to cow opposition, including the use of torture devices and public executions that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to imperial brutality. The execution of the young Alexios II in 1183, accomplished through strangulation with a bowstring, demonstrated the emperor's willingness to commit any crime to maintain power. The economic consequences of Andronikos' policies proved even more damaging than his political violence. The massacre of Western merchants and the confiscation of their property eliminated much of the commercial expertise that had driven Constantinople's economy, while the climate of terror discouraged investment and trade. The Italian maritime republics imposed commercial boycotts that reduced imperial revenues, while the systematic persecution of wealthy families eliminated the tax base necessary for effective governance. The emperor's attempts to fund his administration through increased taxation and currency debasement created hyperinflation that destroyed public confidence in imperial financial management. The revolt that brought Isaac's second Angelus to power in 1185 initially promised relief from Andronikos' tyranny, but the new emperor proved equally incapable of addressing the empire's fundamental problems. Isaac, a member of a prominent aristocratic family with dark hair and a tendency toward corpulence, possessed neither the military experience nor the administrative skills necessary for effective governance during a period of crisis. His reign was characterized by indecision, corruption, and a series of military disasters that further weakened imperial authority and encouraged external aggression. The Bulgarian uprising of 1185, led by the brothers Peter and Asen, exploited the empire's military weakness to establish an independent state in the Balkans for the first time in over a century and a half. The revolt began in the fortress town of Trnovo, where the brothers had gathered support among Bulgarian nobles, resentful of increased imperial taxation and the appointment of Greek officials to positions traditionally held by local aristocrats. The initial success of the rebellion, including the defeat of imperial forces at the Battle of Triavna, demonstrated the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics against the empire's demoralized and poorly equipped armies. The systematic Bulgarian conquest of the Balkan interior proceeded with remarkable speed as imperial garrisons abandoned their positions or defected to the rebels. The capture of Plovdiv in 1186 provided the Bulgarians with a major administrative centre and substantial military resources, while their alliance with Cuman tribes from beyond the Danube gave them the cavalry forces necessary to challenge imperial armies in open battle. The proclamation of the Second Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Peter marked the permanent loss of territories that had been integral to Byzantine power since the conquests of Basil II. The empire's simultaneous conflicts with the Normans of Sicily further strained its limited military resources and revealed the inadequacy of its defensive preparations. The Norman invasion of the Balkans in 1185, led by William II of Sicily, aimed to exploit Byzantine weakness through the conquest of Thessalonica and the establishment of a Norman principality in northern Greece. The Norman army, transported by a fleet of 200 ships, included approximately 80,000 men equipped with the latest Western military technology and experienced in Mediterranean warfare. The siege of Thessalonica, which began in August 1185, demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman siege techniques against Byzantine fortifications that had not been significantly updated since the 11th century. The city's massive walls, built during the reign of Theodosius I, featured towers and gates that provided strong defensive positions, but the Norman deployment of trebuchets and mining operations created breaches that the garrison could not repair. The systematic bombardment of the city's residential areas created panic among the civilian population, while the cutting of water supplies forced the defenders to consider surrender terms. The fall of Thessalonica after a 10-day siege shocked the Byzantine world and demonstrated the empire's inability to defend its second-largest city against determined assault. The Norman occupation, characterized by systematic looting and the massacre of civilians who had resisted the siege, eliminated much of the city's commercial infrastructure and displaced thousands of residents. The capture of the city's enormous wealth, accumulated through centuries of trade between Constantinople and Western Europe, provided the Normans with resources for further expansion while depriving the empire of crucial tax revenues. The Norman advance toward Constantinople appeared unstoppable until the death of William II in November 1189 forced the abandonment of the campaign. The recall of Norman forces to Sicily for the succession crisis eliminated the immediate threat to the capital, but the ease of their initial conquests had demonstrated the empire's military weakness to enemies throughout the Mediterranean world. The systematic destruction of Thessalonica's defences and the displacement of its population created a power vacuum in northern Greece that would be filled by Bulgarian and Serbian expansion. The Third Crusade's passage through Byzantine territories in 1189 to 1190 created additional challenges for Isaac's government, while revealing the fundamental changes that had occurred in the relationship between the empire and Western Christendom. The massive armies led by Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus, and Richard the Lionheart no longer viewed the Byzantine Empire as a valuable ally, but rather as an obstacle to their objectives in the Holy Land. The Crusaders' demands for free passage, supplies, and logistical support exceeded the empire's capabilities, while their suspicions of Byzantine loyalty to the Islamic world created constant diplomatic tensions. The confrontation between Isaac and Frederick Barbarossa at Adrianople in 1189 nearly resulted in a direct military conflict between the Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick's army of approximately 100,000 men, including the most experienced knights in Europe, possessed overwhelming military superiority over the imperial forces that Isaac could assemble. The German emperor's demands for tribute and hostages, combined with his threats to capture Constantinople, demonstrated the extent to which the empire's international position had deteriorated since the days of Manuel I. The diplomatic resolution of the crisis through the Treaty of Adrianople required substantial imperial concessions, including the provision of supplies, guides and transportation across the Bosphorus for the German army. The agreement's terms also included the release of German prisoners and the payment of compensation for alleged Byzantine attacks on crusading forces. The treaty's humiliating provisions demonstrated the empire's inability to resist Western demands and establish precedents for future crusading expeditions. The coup that brought Alexios III Angelus to power in 1195 through the overthrow and blinding of his brother Isaac represented the culmination of the political instability that had plagued the empire since Manuel's death. Alexios, a man of medium height with greying hair and a reputation for indecision, had spent years plotting against his brother while building support among court officials and military commanders. His seizure of power required the complicity of the Varangian Guard, whose loyalty had been purchased through promises of increased pay and privileges. The new emperor's reign was characterized by the systematic looting of imperial resources for personal enrichment and the maintenance of a luxurious court lifestyle that contrasted sharply with the empire's deteriorating military and financial situation. Alexios's sale of government offices to the highest bidders created a corrupt administration that prioritized personal profit over effective governance, while his debasement of the currency to fund court expenses destroyed public confidence in imperial financial management. The emperor's notorious laziness and reluctance to make difficult decisions paralysed the government during a period that required decisive action to address mounting external threats. The formation of the Fourth Crusade in 1199 initially appeared to pose no direct threat to Byzantine territories, as the expedition's stated objective involved the conquest of Egypt rather than operations in the eastern Mediterranean. The Crusades' organisation by Pope Innocent III represented an attempt to restore papal control over the crusading movement, while achieving the strategic objective of attacking Islamic power at its Egyptian centre. The participation of prominent nobles like Baldwin of Flanders and Boniface of Montferrat suggested that the expedition would possess the military strength necessary for success against Ayyubid forces. The Crusaders' decision to contract with Venice for naval transportation proved fateful, as it placed the expedition under the influence of Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man whose personal hatred of the Byzantine Empire would ultimately determine the Crusades' direction. Dandolo, now in his 90s and completely blind, possessed an exceptional memory and ruthless determination that made him one of the most formidable political leaders of his age. His personal experiences during diplomatic missions to Constantinople, including alleged mistreatment that had contributed to his blindness, had created a desire for revenge that would shape Venetian policy throughout the crisis. The financial arrangements between the Crusaders and Venice created dependencies that the Doge would exploit to redirect the expedition toward his own objectives. The contract's terms required the Crusaders to pay 85,000 silver marks for transportation and supplies, a sum that exceeded their financial resources and left them dependent on Venetian goodwill for the expedition's continuation. The Crusaders' inability to meet their financial obligations provided Dandolo with leverage that he would use to secure Venetian commercial and territorial objectives at Byzantine expense. The diversion of the crusade to Zara in 1202 demonstrated Dandolo's ability to manipulate the expedition for Venetian purposes while maintaining the fiction of religious motivation. The siege of this Hungarian-controlled city, which had rebelled against Venetian authority, provided Venice with the opportunity to restore its commercial dominance in the Adriatic, while using crusading forces to achieve secular objectives. The papal excommunication of the entire expedition following the capture of Zara failed to deter the Crusaders, who had become dependent on Venetian support for their continued existence. The appearance of Alexios IV Angelus in the crusading camp at Zara provided Dandolo with the pretext necessary for redirecting the expedition toward Constantinople. The young prince, son of the deposed Isaac II, had escaped from imperial custody and sought Western support for his restoration to the throne. His promises of military assistance for the crusade, church reunion, and substantial financial payments appealed to crusaders who were struggling with mounting debts and uncertain prospects for reaching the Holy Land. The negotiations between Alexios IV and the crusading leaders revealed the fundamental misunderstandings that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The prince's promises of 200,000 silver marks and 10,000 troops for the crusade reflected his desperation rather than realistic assessments of imperial capabilities. The Crusaders' acceptance of these terms demonstrated their own financial desperation and their ignorance of the empire's actual resources. Dandolo's support for the diversion reflected his understanding that the proposed expedition would either result in Venetian control over a restored Byzantine government or provide justification for the empire's destruction. The crusading fleet that departed Zara in April 1203 included approximately 20,000 men transported by 200 ships, representing the largest naval expedition in medieval history. The fleet's composition reflected the international character of the crusade, with French, German, Italian, and Flemish contingents serving under their respective noble commanders. The Venetian contribution included not only transportation but also substantial military forces, including crossbowmen and siege specialists whose expertise would prove crucial in the coming operations. The fleet's arrival at Constantinople in June 1203 marked the beginning of the most traumatic episode in Byzantine history. The sight of the massive Western Armada anchored in the Bosphorus created panic among the city's population, who had never witnessed such a concentration of naval power. The Crusaders' demands for Alexios III's abdication and the restoration of Isaac II met with rejection, as the emperor correctly assessed that compliance would merely delay rather than prevent the city's conquest. The first siege of Constantinople demonstrated both the strength of the city's fortifications and the effectiveness of Western siege techniques. The attack on the Golden Horn chain, which protected the harbour from naval assault, required coordinated operations between Venetian ships and crusading land forces. The successful breaching of the chain allowed the crusading fleet to enter the harbour and establish control over the city's northern approaches, while simultaneous attacks on the land walls tested the defenders' ability to maintain their positions. The flight of Alexios III during the night of July 17, 1203, eliminated organised resistance and forced the city's surrender. The emperor's abandonment of his capital, accomplished through a secret escape from the Great Palace, demonstrated the complete collapse of imperial authority and the population's unwillingness to resist the Crusaders without effective leadership. The restoration of Isaac II and the coronation of Alexios IV as co-emperor appeared to fulfill the Crusaders' stated objectives while providing them with the financial support necessary for continuing their expedition. The joint reign of Isaac and Alexios IV proved incapable of fulfilling the promises made to the Crusaders, as the empire's financial resources had been exhausted by decades of mismanagement and military disasters. The new government's attempts to raise the promised funds through increased taxation and the confiscation of church treasures generated widespread resentment among the population, while the presence of Western forces in the city created constant tensions. The Crusaders' demands for immediate payment conflicted with the practical impossibility of extracting such enormous sums from the empire's depleted treasury. The popular uprising that brought Alexios V Doukas to power in January 1204 represented the city's final attempt to resist Western domination through indigenous leadership. The new emperor, known as Mortzouphlos for his distinctive thick eyebrows, had gained support among the population through his opposition to the Crusaders and his promises to restore imperial independence. His execution of Alexios IV and imprisonment of Isaac II eliminated the legal basis for continued crusading presence, while providing justification for renewed military action. The Crusaders' decision to conquer Constantinople for themselves, rather than continue toward the Holy Land, reflected both their financial desperation and their recognition of the empire's wealth and strategic importance. The partition treaty signed in March 1204 divided the anticipated spoils among the expedition's participants, with the Venetians receiving 3/8 of the city and empire, while the remaining territories would be distributed among the crusading nobles. The agreement's detailed provisions for territorial division demonstrated the systematic planning that preceded the final assault. The siege of Constantinople that began in April 1204 employed the full range of Western military technology against the city's ancient defences. The construction of massive siege towers, some reaching heights of over 100 feet, allowed attackers to reach the top of the seawall while providing protection for the troops below. The coordinated assault on April 12, 1204, combined naval attacks from the Golden Horn with land-based assaults on the wall's weakest sections. The breakthrough achieved by the Venetians at the Betrayal Gate created the opening that allowed thousands of crusaders to pour into the city. The 3-day sack of Constantinople that followed the city's capture represented one of history's most devastating acts of cultural destruction. The systematic looting of churches, palaces and private residences eliminated artistic treasures that had been accumulated over 9 centuries of imperial rule. The Hagia Sophia was stripped of its precious ornaments, while the bronze horses of the Hippodrome were transported to Venice along with countless other artworks. The Library of Constantinople, containing thousands of ancient manuscripts, was destroyed or dispersed, resulting in the permanent loss of classical texts that had survived since antiquity. The human cost of the conquest was equally devastating, as thousands of civilians were killed during the sack, while many more were sold into slavery. The systematic rape and murder of the city's inhabitants, including clergy and nobles, demonstrated the complete breakdown of military discipline that characterized the occupation. The destruction of the city's infrastructure, including aqueducts, harbours and public buildings, eliminated the physical foundations that had supported the empire's administration for centuries. The establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople under Baldwin of Flanders represented an attempt to create a Western feudal state using Byzantine territories and resources. The new emperor, a man of imposing height with blonde hair and blue eyes, possessed extensive experience in Flemish politics but lacked understanding of the complex administrative systems that had governed the empire. His coronation in the Hagia Sophia on May 16, 1204, symbolised the complete displacement of Byzantine authority by Western institutions and personnel. The partition of Byzantine territories among the crusading leaders created a patchwork of Western principalities that bore little resemblance to the unified empire that had existed before 1204. The Kingdom of Thessalonica, granted to Boniface of Montferrat, controlled much of northern Greece and Macedonia, while the Principality of Achaia encompassed the Peloponnese under Geoffrey of Villehardouin. The Duchy of Athens, established under Otho de la Roche, included central Greece and the islands of the Aegean Sea. These territories were organised according to Western feudal principles that conflicted with Byzantine administrative traditions and local customs. The Venetian acquisitions included the most strategically valuable territories, reflecting Dandelo's sophisticated understanding of commercial and naval requirements. Venice received 3/8 of Constantinople itself, including the crucial harbour facilities of the Golden Horn, along with the islands of Crete and Euboea. The Venetian control of the Dardanelles and key positions throughout the Aegean Sea provided the Republic with dominance over the trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. The systematic Venetian colonization of these territories created permanent bases for commercial expansion throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The survival of Byzantine resistance in unconquered territories demonstrated the empire's resilience and the strength of imperial ideology among the Greek-speaking population. The establishment of the Empire of Nicaea under Theodore I Lascaris provided the most significant centre of Byzantine continuity, as this territory included much of western Anatolia and maintained the administrative and military traditions of the imperial system. Lascaris, a member of a prominent aristocratic family with extensive military experience, had escaped from Constantinople during the siege and established his capital at Nicaea, the site of the First Ecumenical Council. The Empire of Trebizond, founded by Alexios and David Komnenos with Georgian support, controlled the important trade routes connecting the Black Sea to Central Asia. The two brothers, grandsons of Andronikos I, had established their independent state in April 1204, shortly before Constantinople's fall. Their empire, centred on the wealthy port city of Trebizond, maintained extensive commercial relationships with Italian merchants while preserving Byzantine court ceremonies and administrative practices. The state's strategic position on the Black Sea coast provided it with revenues from the lucrative trade in luxury goods from Asia. The Despotate of Epirus, established by Michael I Komnenos Doukas, encompassed the mountainous regions of northwestern Greece and southern Albania. This territory, with its capital at Arta, controlled the important Via Egnatia that connected the Adriatic coast to Thessalonica. Michael, a cousin of the Angelus emperors, had gathered support among the local Greek population who resented Latin rule and sought restoration of Byzantine authority. The despotate's strategic position allowed it to threaten both the Latin Empire and the Kingdom of Thessalonica while maintaining independence through skillful diplomacy. The competition among these Byzantine successor states for the right to restore the empire created complex political dynamics that would influence the region's development for decades. Each state claimed to represent the legitimate continuation of imperial authority, while their rulers adopted the title of emperor and maintained the ceremonial traditions of the Byzantine court. The rivalry between Nicaea and Epirus proved particularly intense, as both states possessed the territorial extent and military capabilities necessary for serious attempts at reconquest. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken by the successor states revealed their sophisticated understanding of international politics and their ability to exploit the divisions among their enemies. The Empire of Nicaea's alliance with the Bulgarian Empire provided mutual support against Latin expansion, while similar agreements with the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum secured the Anatolian frontier. The Despotate of Epirus cultivated relationships with Western powers, including the papacy and various Italian cities, while maintaining contacts with Orthodox populations throughout the Balkans. The military innovations developed by the successor states reflected their adaptation to the changed circumstances of warfare in the post-1204 period. The Empire of Nicaea's emphasis on cavalry forces and fortified positions provided effective defence against Latin heavy cavalry, while the development of new siege techniques enabled the systematic reconquest of fortified cities. The recruitment of Western mercenaries and the adoption of selected Western military practices demonstrated the flexibility that characterized Byzantine military adaptation. The restoration of Michael VIII, Palaiologos to the throne of a reunited Byzantine Empire in 1261 marked not the beginning of a new golden age, but rather the commencement of a prolonged struggle for survival that would define the empire's final 2 centuries. The emperor who entered Constantinople through the Golden Gate on August 15, 1261, bore little resemblance to the triumphant conquerors of earlier eras. Michael, a man of medium height with dark hair and penetrating eyes, had spent years manoeuvring through the complex politics of the Empire of Nicaea before seizing power through a carefully orchestrated coup against the legitimate Lascaris dynasty. His usurpation of the throne from the young John IV Lascaris, whom he had blinded to prevent future challenges, demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize his approach to the empire's mounting problems. The empire that Michael inherited was a shadow of its former self, reduced to Constantinople and its immediate environs, portions of western Anatolia, and scattered territories in the Aegean islands. The capital itself bore the scars of the Latin occupation, with many of its greatest monuments damaged or stripped of their treasures. The Hagia Sophia's magnificent interior had been defaced by Latin alterations, while the great palace complex lay partially in ruins. The city's population, estimated at fewer than 100,000 inhabitants, represented a dramatic decline from the 400,000 residents who had lived there before 1204. The economic infrastructure that had supported the empire's former greatness had been systematically dismantled, with Italian merchants now controlling the trade routes that had once enriched imperial coffers. The territorial challenges facing the restored empire were staggering in their complexity and scope. The Turkish beyliks that had emerged in Anatolia during the period of Latin rule had established permanent settlements throughout the peninsula, transforming regions that had been the heartland of Byzantine power into Islamic emirates. The Sultanate of Rum, though weakened by Mongol invasions, still controlled much of central Anatolia, while smaller Turkish principalities had carved out territories along the Aegean coast and in the Pontic regions. These beyliks, including the emerging Osmanli beylik under Osman I, possessed the military mobility and religious motivation necessary to continue their expansion at Byzantine expense. The demographic catastrophe that had befallen the empire during the 57 years of Latin rule proved even more devastating than the territorial losses. The systematic emigration of Greek-speaking populations to the successor states, combined with the settlement of Western colonists in former Byzantine territories, had fundamentally altered the empire's ethnic composition. The theme system that had provided military manpower for centuries had been completely destroyed, leaving the empire dependent on expensive mercenary forces whose loyalty fluctuated with their pay. The agricultural productivity of the remaining territories had declined dramatically due to constant warfare and the displacement of farming populations, reducing the tax base available for military and administrative expenses. Michael's immediate priority involved securing the empire's survival against the coalition of enemies that had formed to reverse the Byzantine restoration. The Latin Empire's remnants, supported by Venice and the papacy, maintained claims to Constantinople and sought Western military assistance for a new crusade. The Bulgarians under Constantine posed a direct threat to the empire's Balkan territories, while the Serbians had expanded their control over much of the Western Balkans during the period of Byzantine weakness. The Genoese, seeking to challenge Venetian commercial dominance, offered potential alliance opportunities, but their support came with demands for commercial privileges that would further erode imperial economic independence. The emperor's military reforms reflected his understanding that the empire could no longer maintain the large standing armies that had characterized earlier periods. The creation of the Elegian system, which organized military units around family groups and regional loyalties, attempted to recreate the personal bonds that had made the theme armies effective, while adapting to the empire's reduced territorial extent. These units, typically numbering between 200 and 400 men, were granted landholdings in exchange for military service. but the system's effectiveness was limited by the shortage of suitable agricultural land and the constant threat of enemy raids. The development of a new naval strategy became crucial for the empire's survival, as control of the sea lanes remained essential for maintaining communication between the empire's scattered territories. Michael's investment in shipbuilding programs, concentrated in the naval bases of Constantinople and the Aegean islands, produced vessels designed for rapid coastal operations rather than the massive fleet actions that had characterized earlier periods. The recruitment of experienced sailors from the maritime communities of the Aegean provided the empire with naval expertise, while the adoption of new navigational techniques and ship designs improved the effectiveness of Byzantine naval operations. The theological controversies that erupted during Michael's reign reflected his desperate attempts to secure Western support against the empire's enemies through religious reconciliation. The emperor's negotiations with Pope Urban IV regarding church reunion represented a fundamental departure from the traditional Byzantine position on papal authority. The proposed union would have required the Eastern Church to acknowledge papal supremacy and accept the Western position on the Filioque controversy, concessions that generated fierce opposition among the Byzantine clergy and population. The resistance to church union was led by Patriarch Arsenios Autoreianos, who had been appointed by Michael but opposed the emperor's religious policies. Arsenios, a man of austere appearance with a long white beard and intense religious convictions, represented the traditional Orthodox position that viewed any compromise with Rome as betrayal of the true faith. His excommunication of Michael for the usurpation of the throne and the blinding of John IV Lascaris created a schism within the Byzantine Church that weakened imperial authority and provided ammunition for political opponents. The popular opposition to religious union manifested itself in widespread demonstrations and riots throughout the empire's territories. The Zealot movement, which emerged among the monks of Mount Athos and spread to urban populations, combined religious orthodoxy with social protest against the emperor's policies. The Zealots' denunciation of Western influence and their calls for resistance to papal authority resonated among populations who had suffered under Latin rule and viewed any accommodation with Rome as a return to foreign domination. The Second Council of Lyon in 1274 represented the climax of Michael's efforts to achieve church union, as imperial representatives formally accepted papal supremacy and the Western position on disputed theological issues. The council's decisions, proclaimed throughout the empire by imperial decree, required all clergy to acknowledge papal authority and modify their liturgical practices to conform with Roman requirements. The implementation of these changes generated massive resistance, with many bishops refusing to comply and entire monastic communities going into open rebellion against imperial authority. The military consequences of the religious controversy proved devastating for the empire's defensive capabilities. The alienation of the monastic communities, which had traditionally provided moral support for imperial armies, weakened military morale and reduced recruitment from devoutly orthodox populations. The clergy's opposition to the emperor's policies created divisions within the administrative system, as many officials refused to implement religious reforms while maintaining their loyalty to traditional orthodox practices. The cultural achievements of the Paleologos period, despite the empire's political and military difficulties, represented one of the most remarkable intellectual flowerings in Byzantine history. The scholars who gathered in Constantinople during the Restoration period, including Maximos Planudes, Manuel Chrysokokes, and Nikephoros Gregoras, produced works of exceptional sophistication that synthesized classical learning with contemporary theological and philosophical developments. Their efforts to preserve and transmit ancient Greek texts ensured the survival of classical literature that would prove crucial for the later Renaissance in Western Europe. The development of new artistic styles during this period reflected both the empire's reduced circumstances and its continued cultural vitality. The mosaics created in the Carrière Camille under the patronage of Theodore Metachites demonstrated the sophisticated theological symbolism and artistic technique that characterized the Palaiologos Renaissance. These works, completed between 1315 and 1321, combined traditional Byzantine iconographic programs with innovative artistic techniques that created unprecedented emotional depth and psychological complexity. The manuscript illumination produced during this period achieved new levels of artistic sophistication, as scriptoriums throughout the empire created elaborately decorated books that preserved classical texts while developing new forms of visual expression. The Paris Psalter and other imperial manuscripts demonstrated the fusion of classical and Christian themes that characterized Palaiologos art, while their technical excellence revealed the continued vitality of Byzantine artistic traditions despite the empire's political difficulties. The philosophical achievements of the period were exemplified by the work of Gemistos Plethon, whose synthesis of Platonic philosophy with orthodox theology created new frameworks for understanding the relationship between reason and faith. Plethon's influence extended far beyond the empire's borders, as his teachings attracted students from throughout Europe and contributed to the revival of Platonic studies in the West. His establishment of a philosophical academy in Mistra demonstrated the continued intellectual vitality of Byzantine culture, even as the empire's political power declined. The theological controversies of the period, particularly the Hesychast movement led by Gregory Palamas, represented attempts to revitalize orthodox spirituality through mystical practices and theological innovation. The Hesychasts' emphasis on direct spiritual experience and their development of sophisticated theological arguments regarding the nature of divine grace created new forms of religious expression that influenced Orthodox Christianity for centuries. The movement's political implications, including its opposition to Western theological influences and its support for traditional Orthodox practices, aligned it with popular resistance to the emperor's union policies. The gradual Ottoman encroachment on Byzantine territories began during the reign of Andronikos II, as the Osmanli Beylik under Osman first systematically expanded its control over northwestern Anatolia. The Ottomans' success reflected their superior military organization, their ability to attract Muslim Ghazi warriors seeking religious merit through warfare against Christians, and their adoption of innovative siege techniques that proved effective against Byzantine fortifications. The capture of Bursa in 1326 provided the Ottomans with a major administrative centre and substantial resources for further expansion. The Ottoman military system, based on the Devshirme recruitment of Christian boys who were converted to Islam and trained as elite soldiers, created a disciplined and loyal military force that surpassed the capabilities of Byzantine armies. The Janissary Corps, established during this period, combined the religious motivation of Islamic holy war with the tactical discipline of professional soldiers. Their use of firearms, adopted from Western military technology, provided them with significant advantages over traditional Byzantine cavalry and infantry formations. The siege warfare techniques developed by the Ottomans proved particularly effective against the fortified cities that formed the backbone of Byzantine defence. The systematic use of cannons, first employed in the siege of Constantinople in 1453, represented a technological revolution that rendered traditional fortifications obsolete. The Ottomans' ability to transport heavy artillery across difficult terrain and their development of specialised siege tactics enabled them to capture fortified positions that had previously been considered impregnable. The transformation of the empire into a small state centred on Constantinople and scattered territories reflected the fundamental changes in the balance of power that had occurred since 1204. The loss of Anatolia to Turkish expansion eliminated the agricultural and demographic base that had supported imperial power for centuries, while the empire's remaining territories were too small and scattered to provide adequate resources for effective resistance. The emperor's role gradually evolved from that of a major international power to that of a local ruler dependent on foreign support for survival. The economic consequences of territorial reduction proved devastating for the empire's financial stability. The loss of the Anatolian themes eliminated the tax revenues that had funded imperial administration and military forces, while the empire's remaining territories generated insufficient income to maintain even minimal defensive capabilities. The debasement of the imperial currency, necessary to fund military operations, destroyed confidence in Byzantine economic stability and encouraged the use of foreign currencies in commercial transactions. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken by successive Palaiologos emperors reveal their sophisticated understanding of international politics and their ability to exploit divisions among their enemies. The alliance with Genoa against Venetian commercial dominance provided temporary relief from economic pressure, while agreements with various Western powers offered potential military support in exchange for religious concessions. The empire's diplomatic relations with the emerging Ottoman state involved complex negotiations that sought to delay conquest through tribute payments and territorial concessions. The internal political struggles that characterized the Palaiologos period reflected the empire's institutional weaknesses and the competing interests of various social groups. The conflict between the aristocratic families who sought to maintain their traditional privileges and the imperial government's need for resources to fund defensive operations created constant tension within the administrative system. The emergence of autonomous regional authorities, particularly in the Morea and other distant territories, demonstrated the central government's inability to maintain effective control over the empire's scattered possessions. The cultural exchange between the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe during this period facilitated the transmission of classical learning that would prove crucial for the Renaissance. The migration of Byzantine scholars to Western universities, accelerated by the empire's political difficulties, brought Greek texts and scholarly traditions to audiences that had previously lacked access to this knowledge. The establishment of Greek studies programs in Western universities created permanent institutional frameworks for the preservation and study of Byzantine intellectual achievements. The military innovations developed during the Palaiologos period reflected the empire's adaptation to changed circumstances and its attempts to maximize the effectiveness of limited resources. The emphasis on defensive warfare and the construction of new fortifications demonstrated the empire's realistic assessment of its capabilities, while the recruitment of Western mercenaries and the adoption of new military technologies showed its willingness to adapt to contemporary military developments. The dawn of the 15th century found the Byzantine Empire reduced to a collection of isolated territories that bore little resemblance to the vast dominion that had once controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, who had assumed the throne in 1391, ruled over a truncated state consisting primarily of Constantinople and its immediate suburbs, the Morea in southern Greece, and a handful of Aegean islands. The empire's total population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, while its annual revenues barely exceeded those of a modest Italian city-state. The emperor himself, a man of impressive height with prematurely grey hair and deeply lined features that reflected decades of military campaigning, understood that his empire's survival depended not on military strength, but on diplomatic cunning and the exploitation of divisions among his enemies. The Ottoman threat had evolved from periodic raids into a systematic campaign of territorial conquest that threatened to eliminate the last vestiges of Byzantine independence. Sultan Bayezid I, known as Yildirim for his rapid military campaigns, had assembled the most formidable military machine in the eastern Mediterranean. His army combined the traditional mobility of Turkish cavalry with innovative siege techniques and a disciplined infantry force that had proven devastatingly effective against Christian fortifications. The Sultan's court at Bursa attracted military engineers from across the Islamic world, while his treasury, enriched by decades of conquest, provided the resources necessary for prolonged military operations. The Ottoman siege of Constantinople that began in 1394 represented the most serious threat to the city's survival since the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries. Bayezid's forces, numbering approximately 40,000 men, established a complete blockade of the city's landward approaches, while Ottoman naval forces controlled the Bosphorus and Golden Horn. The siege lines, constructed with typical Ottoman efficiency, featured elaborate earthworks and wooden palisades that prevented any relief from reaching the beleaguered garrison. The Sultan's personal involvement in the siege operations, including his establishment of a command post within sight of the city walls, demonstrated his determination to complete the conquest that had eluded his predecessors. The siege's psychological impact on Constantinople's population proved as devastating as its military effects. The city's inhabitants, who had endured decades of Ottoman pressure and territorial losses, understood that this assault represented their final test of survival. The emperor's daily appearances on the walls, where he could be seen directing defensive preparations and encouraging the garrison, provided crucial moral support for the defenders. The systematic rationing of food supplies, implemented under the supervision of the city's remaining administrative officials, ensured that the population could endure a prolonged siege despite the complete disruption of normal supply lines. The Ottoman siege techniques employed against Constantinople revealed the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that the empire had developed during its expansion. The construction of massive stone-throwing trebuchets, positioned to bombard the city's walls from multiple angles, demonstrated the Ottomans' mastery of traditional siege warfare. The deployment of early firearms, including primitive cannons that could breach sections of the ancient fortifications, provided a glimpse of the technological revolution that would ultimately doom medieval defensive systems. The systematic mining operations directed against the wall's foundations required engineering expertise that rivaled the greatest achievements of Roman military technology. The defenders' response to the siege demonstrated both their tactical skill and their desperate determination to preserve their city's independence. The repair of wall breaches, accomplished under constant enemy fire by teams of civilian volunteers and professional masons, prevented the Ottomans from exploiting their artillery advantages. The deployment of Greek fire against Ottoman siege engines, utilizing the ancient incendiary compound that had protected the city for centuries, created spectacular conflagrations that destroyed expensive equipment and demoralized enemy troops. The coordination of sorties against Ottoman positions, led by the emperor himself and the city's remaining professional soldiers, disrupted enemy operations and maintained the initiative despite the defenders' numerical disadvantage. The arrival of news regarding Timur's advance into Anatolia in 1402 transformed the strategic situation and provided the empire with an unexpected reprieve from Ottoman pressure. The Mongol conqueror, known as Tamerlan in Western sources, had assembled a massive army estimated at over 200,000 men for his campaign against the Ottoman Empire. Timur's forces, drawn from across his vast Central Asian domains, included experienced cavalry units that had conquered territories from India to the Caspian Sea. The Mongol army's reputation for ruthless efficiency and its leaders' personal charisma attracted Turkish tribal leaders who had grown resentful of Ottoman centralization and taxation policies. The Battle of Ankara, on July 28, 1402, represented one of the most decisive military engagements in medieval history, as Timur's forces annihilated the Ottoman army and captured Sultan Bayezid himself. The battle's outcome resulted from a combination of tactical brilliance and political maneuvering that demonstrated Timur's superior understanding of steppe warfare. The Mongol deployment, which utilized the mobility of horse archers to disrupt Ottoman formations while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily armoured troops, proved devastatingly effective against an army that had been optimized for siege warfare and operations against sedentary populations. The psychological impact of Bayezid's capture resonated throughout the Islamic world and provided Christian populations with hope that Ottoman expansion could be reversed. The Sultan's treatment in Mongol captivity, including his confinement in an iron cage that became legendary throughout Europe, symbolised the dramatic reversal of fortune that had befallen the Ottoman Empire. The systematic destruction of Ottoman administrative centres throughout Anatolia eliminated the governmental infrastructure that had supported Turkish expansion, while the massacre of Ottoman officials and their families created a power vacuum that would persist for decades. The Ottoman interregnum that followed Bayezid's death in 1403 plunged the empire into a civil war that lasted over a decade and provided the Byzantine Empire with its longest period of respite since the 14th century. The struggle between Bayezid's sons, Suleiman in Europe, Isa in Bursa, and Mehmed in Amasya, divided Ottoman resources and attention among competing claimants who lacked their father's military genius and political authority. The civil war's intensity, characterised by shifting alliances and brutal, fratricidal conflicts, demonstrated the fragility of the Ottoman political system when deprived of strong central leadership. Manuel II's diplomatic exploitation of the Ottoman civil war revealed his sophisticated understanding of Islamic politics and his ability to play competing factions against each other. The emperor's separate agreements with different Ottoman claimants, which provided each with limited military support in exchange for territorial concessions and tribute reductions, maximised Byzantine advantages while minimising military commitments. The recovery of several fortified positions along the Bosphorus, including the strategically crucial fortress of Anatoli Hisari, provided the empire with improved defensive capabilities and control over the Strait's Asian approaches. The gradual Ottoman reunification under Mehmed I, completed by 1413, restored Turkish unity but revealed the permanent changes that the interregnum had created within the empire's structure. The new sultan, known as Çelebi Mehmed for his scholarly interests and relatively moderate policies, faced the enormous task of rebuilding an administrative system that had been shattered by civil war and Mongol destruction. His approach to governance, which emphasised negotiation over conquest and administrative efficiency over military expansion, provided the Byzantine Empire with additional breathing space, while the Ottomans consolidated their remaining territories. The respite provided by Ottoman weakness allowed Manuel II to undertake extensive diplomatic missions to Western Europe in search of military assistance against the eventual resumption of Turkish expansion. The emperor's personal journey to Paris, London, and other European capitals between 1399 and 1403 represented an unprecedented departure from Byzantine diplomatic tradition, as no reigning emperor had previously travelled so extensively in search of foreign support. Manuel's impressive physical presence and his fluency in Latin made him an effective advocate for his empire's cause, while his detailed knowledge of Ottoman military capabilities provided Western audiences with valuable intelligence about their potential enemies. The Western response to Manuel's diplomatic initiatives revealed both the theoretical support for Byzantine survival and the practical limitations that prevented effective military assistance. The French court's reception of the emperor, characterised by elaborate ceremonies and expressions of sympathy for the empire's plight, generated significant publicity for the Byzantine cause but produced limited concrete results. The English government's preoccupation with the 100 Years' War and domestic political instability prevented any substantial military commitment, while the German prince's fragmented authority made coordinated action impossible. The theological discussions that accompanied Manuel's diplomatic missions demonstrated the persistent religious obstacles to effective Byzantine-Western cooperation. The emperor's willingness to discuss church reunion, motivated by his desperate need for military support, encountered resistance from both Western clergy who demanded complete Orthodox submission and Eastern theologians who viewed any compromise as betrayal of the true faith. The complexity of doctrinal differences, particularly regarding papal authority and the Filioque controversy, proved impossible to resolve through diplomatic negotiations conducted under the pressure of military crisis. The Council of Constance, which convened from 1414 to 1418, to resolve the Western Schism provided the Byzantine Empire with an opportunity to participate in the broader movement for church reform and reunion. The imperial delegation, led by experienced theologians and diplomats, presented the orthodox position on disputed issues while emphasizing the empire's willingness to negotiate on matters that did not compromise fundamental doctrinal principles. The council's preoccupation with resolving Western ecclesiastical disputes, however, left little time for addressing the complex issues that divided Eastern and Western Christianity. The reign of John VIII Palaiologos, who succeeded his father Manuel in 1425, marked a new phase in the empire's desperate struggle for survival as Ottoman power gradually recovered from the disruptions of the interregnum. The new emperor, a man of medium height with dark hair and intense eyes that reflected his awareness of the empire's precarious situation, possessed neither his father's diplomatic skills nor his military experience. His reign would be dominated by the increasingly urgent search for Western military assistance and the growing internal divisions over the price that such support would require. The resumption of Ottoman expansion under Murad II, who had consolidated his authority by 1421, eliminated any remaining illusions about the empire's ability to survive through diplomatic manoeuvring alone. The new sultan, experienced military commander with a methodical approach to conquest, systematically eliminated the remaining Byzantine strongholds in Anatolia, while tightening the noose around Constantinople itself. The Ottoman conquest of Thessalonica in 1430, accomplished through a combination of siege warfare and naval blockade, demonstrated the empire's inability to defend even its most important remaining territories. The siege of Thessalonica revealed the devastating effectiveness of Ottoman military innovations, particularly their use of early firearms and sophisticated siege techniques. The city's ancient walls, which had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries, proved inadequate against the systematic bombardment of Ottoman cannons. The defenders' heroic resistance, led by the city's remaining Byzantine officials and supported by the local population, could not compensate for the overwhelming technological and numerical advantages that the attackers possessed. The city's fall eliminated the empire's last major stronghold outside the immediate vicinity of Constantinople. The psychological impact of Thessalonica's loss resonated throughout the remaining Byzantine territories and convinced many that only immediate Western intervention could prevent the empire's complete destruction. The systematic massacre of the city's defenders and the enslavement of its population provided a grim preview of Constantinople's likely fate if the Ottomans succeeded in their ultimate objective. The refugees who fled to the capital brought detailed accounts of Ottoman military capabilities and siege techniques that would prove valuable for defensive preparations, but also contributed to the growing sense of desperation among the city's inhabitants. The Council of Florence, convened in 1439 under papal auspices, represented the Byzantine Empire's final attempt to secure Western military assistance through religious reunion. The council's location, chosen to accommodate the large Eastern delegation while providing a neutral setting for theological discussions, attracted representatives from throughout the Orthodox world. The Byzantine delegation, led by Emperor John VIII himself, included the most distinguished theologians and church officials of the empire, while the Western participants represented the full hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. The theological debates that dominated the council's proceedings revealed the profound differences that continue to divide Eastern and Western Christianity, despite centuries of intermittent dialogue. The discussion of papal authority, which formed the core of the reunion negotiations, exposed fundamental disagreements about the nature of ecclesiastical governance and the relationship between temporal and spiritual power. The Orthodox position, articulated by scholars like Mark Eugenikos, emphasized the traditional autonomy of Eastern churches and their rejection of papal supremacy, while Western theologians insisted that reunion required complete acknowledgement of Roman authority. The Filioque controversy, which had divided the churches since the 9th century, proved equally intractable despite the sophisticated theological arguments presented by both sides. The Eastern delegation's insistence that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone conflicted with the Western position that the Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son. The theological subtleties involved in this dispute, while seemingly arcane to modern observers, represented fundamental differences in understanding the nature of the Trinity and the authority of ecclesiastical tradition. The Emperor's personal intervention in the Council's deliberations demonstrated his desperate commitment to achieving reunion, regardless of the theological costs involved. John's willingness to accept papal authority and Western doctrinal positions, motivated by his understanding that only immediate military assistance could save his empire, generated fierce opposition from many members of his own delegation. The Emperor's political calculations, which prioritized imperial survival over theological consistency, reflected the impossible choices that faced the empire's leadership during its final decades. The Act of Union, signed by the Emperor and most of the Eastern delegation on July 6, 1439, formally ended the schism that had divided Christianity since 1054. The document's provisions required the Eastern churches to acknowledge papal supremacy, accept the Western position on the Filioque, and modify their liturgical practices to conform with Roman requirements. The Union's terms, while providing the theoretical basis for Western military assistance, generated immediate opposition from Orthodox populations throughout the empire, who viewed the agreement as a betrayal of their religious heritage. The popular resistance to the Union manifested itself in widespread demonstrations and riots throughout the empire's remaining territories. The monk Gennadios Scholarios, who had initially supported the Union negotiations, emerged as the leader of the anti-Unionist movement after his return from Florence. His denunciation of the Union as a heretical compromise with Roman error resonated among the common people, who had suffered under Latin rule during the 13th century and viewed any accommodation with Rome as a return to foreign domination. The division of Byzantine society into Unionist and anti-Unionist factions created internal conflicts that severely weakened the empire's ability to prepare for its final confrontation with the Ottomans. The Unionist party, led by the emperor and supported by some members of the aristocracy, argued that religious compromise was necessary for physical survival and that theological differences were less important than preserving the empire's independence. The anti-Unionist majority, which included most of the clergy and the common people, maintained that spiritual integrity was more valuable than temporal power, and that God would protect the empire if it remained faithful to Orthodox tradition. The practical consequences of this religious division extended far beyond theological debate to encompass fundamental questions of military preparation and popular morale. The anti-Unionist clergy's refusal to pray for Western military assistance, or to encourage their congregations to support the emperor's policies, created a climate of defeatism that undermined defensive preparations. The popular belief that the Union had forfeited divine protection made many inhabitants reluctant to participate in the city's defence, while the expectation of divine punishment for religious apostasy created panic during critical moments of the siege. The Western response to the Union proved far more limited than the emperor had hoped, as European powers remained preoccupied with their own conflicts and unwilling to commit substantial resources to Eastern Mediterranean operations. The papal call for a new crusade generated some enthusiasm among Western clergy, but failed to produce the large-scale military intervention that the empire desperately needed. These small expeditionary forces that did reach Constantinople, including a Genoese contingent under Giovanni Justiniani, provided valuable military expertise, but lacked the numerical strength necessary to alter the strategic balance. The accession of Mehmed II to the Ottoman throne in 1451 marked the beginning of the final phase of the empire's existence, as the new sultan possessed both the military resources and the personal determination necessary to complete the conquest of Constantinople. The young ruler, only 19 years old but already experienced in military command, had inherited an empire that had recovered from the disruptions of the early 15th century and possessed the technological and organisational capabilities necessary for siege warfare against the most formidable fortifications in the medieval world. Mehmed's personal characteristics combined intellectual brilliance with ruthless ambition in a manner that made him uniquely suited for the challenges of conquering Constantinople. His fluency in multiple languages, including Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Persian, reflected his sophisticated education and his understanding of the diverse cultures within his empire. His intense interest in military technology and siege warfare, demonstrated through his patronage of engineers and artillery specialists, provided him with the technical knowledge necessary to overcome the city's ancient defences. The systematic military preparations that Mehmed undertook during 1452 revealed his methodical approach to the conquest and his understanding of the logistical challenges involved in besieging such a heavily fortified position. The construction of Rumeli Hisari, a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the existing Anatolian fortress, provided the Ottomans with complete control over the strait and eliminated any possibility of external assistance reaching the city. The fortress's rapid construction, completed in less than 5 months, demonstrated the organisational capabilities that would characterise the entire siege operation. The recruitment and training of the Ottoman army that would conduct the siege involved the mobilisation of resources from throughout the empire's territories. The Janissary Corps, now numbering approximately 12,000 men, provided the disciplined infantry force necessary for assault operations, while the provincial cavalry units contributed the mobility required for maintaining the siege lines. The recruitment of specialist troops, including miners, engineers, and artillery crews, created a combined arms force that possessed capabilities far exceeding those of any previous Ottoman army. The development of the massive cannons that would breach Constantinople's walls represented the culmination of decades of Ottoman investment in military technology. The great gun constructed by the Hungarian engineer Orbán, measuring over 26 feet in length and capable of firing stone projectiles weighing 1,200 pounds, symbolised the technological revolution that was transforming medieval warfare. The cannon's transportation to the siege lines, accomplished through the construction of special roads and the use of hundreds of oxen, demonstrated the logistical sophistication that supported Ottoman military operations. The psychological warfare that preceded the actual siege proved as important as the military preparations, as Mehmed sought to demoralise the defenders while demonstrating the futility of resistance. The public execution of Byzantine envoys who had attempted to negotiate tribute arrangements sent a clear message that the Sultan would accept nothing less than complete surrender. The systematic destruction of suburban settlements around Constantinople, including the ancient monastery of Staudios, eliminated potential refuge areas while providing building materials for siege works. The display of Ottoman military might during these preliminary operations, including carefully choreographed manoeuvres by the Janissary Corps, created terror among the city's inhabitants who witnessed the disciplined efficiency of their enemies. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, who had succeeded his brother John in 1449, faced the impossible task of defending a city whose population had dwindled to approximately 7,000 able-bodied men against an Ottoman army estimated at over 80,000 troops. The emperor, a man of impressive physical stature with dark hair and a carefully trimmed beard, possessed the military experience and personal courage necessary for the defence, having served with distinction in campaigns throughout the Morea. His leadership during the siege's preparation phase demonstrated both tactical competence and inspirational qualities that maintained morale despite the overwhelming odds his forces faced. The emperor's assessment of the city's defensive capabilities revealed both strengths and critical weaknesses that would determine the siege's outcome. the famous Theodosian walls, stretching for over 4 miles from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, remained formidable obstacles despite their age and the damage inflicted by previous sieges. The double wall system, featuring an inner wall 40 feet high, reinforced by 96 towers, provided multiple defensive lines that could channel attackers into killing zones. The outer wall, though lower, created additional obstacles while providing platforms for defensive artillery. The massive gates, including the famous Golden Gate where emperors had traditionally entered the city in triumph, had been reinforced with additional masonry and blocked with rubble to prevent their use by assault forces. The seawall facing the Golden Horn presented different challenges, as its single line of fortification had been designed to prevent naval assault, rather than the systematic bombardment that Ottoman artillery could deliver. The wall's height of approximately 25 feet provided adequate protection against traditional siege techniques, but its age and the poor quality of repairs conducted during the empire's final decades created vulnerabilities that experienced engineers could exploit. The chain across the Golden Horn, supported by massive towers on both shores, remained the city's most effective defensive feature, preventing Ottoman naval forces from entering the harbour and attacking the seawall from close range. The defensive preparations undertaken during the months preceding the siege demonstrated both the determination of the city's inhabitants and the limitations imposed by the empire's reduced resources. The repair of damaged wall sections, accomplished through the mobilization of the entire adult male population, utilised materials salvaged from ruined buildings and monuments throughout the city. The construction of additional defensive works, including earthen ramparts behind the most vulnerable sections of the wall, provided secondary defensive positions that could be held if the main fortifications were breached. The stockpiling of food supplies, weapons, and ammunition required the systematic requisition of private property and the conversion of churches and public buildings into military depots. The international dimension of the city's defence reflected the broader European interest in preventing Ottoman expansion into the heart of Christendom. The Genoese contingent under Giovanni Justiniani, numbering approximately 700 experienced soldiers, provided crucial military expertise and leadership that complemented the emperor's own capabilities. Justiniani, a professional condottiere with extensive experience in siege warfare, assumed responsibility for defending the most vulnerable section of the land wall, while training local volunteers in the use of firearms and siege engines. His presence provided a crucial link between the Byzantine defenders and the broader European military tradition. The Venetian contribution to the defence, while limited by the Republic's complex relationship with the Ottoman Empire, included several skilled naval commanders and a small number of warships that helped maintain the Golden Horn chain. The Venetian captain Alvise Diedo, commanding a galley equipped with the latest naval artillery, provided mobile firepower that could respond to Ottoman attempts to breach the harbour defences. The participation of these Italian professionals, despite their small numbers, demonstrated the international character of the struggle and provided the defenders with access to the latest military technologies and tactical innovations. The siege's commencement on April 6, 1453, marked the beginning of the final act in the thousand-year drama of Byzantine history. The Ottoman army's deployment around the city's landward perimeter created a continuous line of investment that prevented any possibility of relief or escape. The systematic construction of siege works, including trenches, palisades, and artillery emplacements, demonstrated the methodical approach that characterized Ottoman military operations. The positioning of the great guns, accomplished through the use of specially constructed platforms and elaborate pulley systems, created battery positions that could deliver concentrated firepower against the most vulnerable sections of the walls. The first major bombardment, conducted on April 12th, revealed the devastating effectiveness of Ottoman artillery against fortifications that had been designed centuries before the development of gunpowder weapons. The massive stone projectiles, fired from distances that placed the guns beyond the range of defensive artillery, created breaches in the outer wall that required constant repair work by the defenders. The psychological impact of the bombardment, characterized by the thunderous noise of the cannons and the clouds of dust and debris created by their impact, proved as significant as the physical damage inflicted on the fortifications. The defenders' response to the artillery bombardment demonstrated both their technical competence and their determination to resist despite overwhelming disadvantages. The rapid repair of wall breaches, accomplished through the use of rubble, timber and earth, prevented the Ottomans from exploiting their artillery advantages through immediate assault. The construction of internal barriers behind damaged sections of the wall created secondary defensive positions that could be held even if the main fortifications were breached. The deployment of the city's limited artillery, including several cannons cast by the Scottish engineer Orban before his defection to the Ottomans, provided defensive firepower that could disrupt enemy siege operations. The Ottoman naval operations in the Golden Horn represented one of the siege's most innovative and psychologically devastating aspects. The transportation of Ottoman ships overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn, accomplished through the construction of a wooden roadway greased with animal fat, demonstrated the engineering capabilities that supported Ottoman military operations. The movement of approximately 70 vessels, including galleys and smaller craft, required the coordination of thousands of workers and the use of oxen and pulleys to overcome the challenging terrain. The appearance of Ottoman ships in the previously secure harbour created panic among the defenders and forced the diversion of troops from the land walls to defend the seawall. The impact of the naval operation extended beyond its immediate military consequences to encompass broader questions of morale and divine favour that influenced both sides' assessment of the siege's likely outcome. The Ottoman success in overcoming what had appeared to be an impossible obstacle reinforced their confidence in ultimate victory, while demonstrating the technical superiority that characterized their military machine. The defenders' shock at seeing enemy vessels in their supposedly secure harbour created doubts about the effectiveness of their defensive preparations and contributed to the growing sense of desperation that would influence the siege's final phases. The systematic Ottoman assault on the seawall, conducted simultaneously with continued bombardment of the land fortifications, forced the defenders to divide their limited manpower between multiple threatened sectors. The deployment of Ottoman infantry and artillery along the Golden Horn shore created new pressure points that required constant vigilance and the construction of additional defensive works. The defenders' response, including the deployment of fire ships and the construction of floating barriers, demonstrated their tactical flexibility, but also revealed the strain that the extended siege was placing on their resources. The heroic resistance of the city's inhabitants during the siege's final weeks reflected both their understanding of the consequences of defeat and their commitment to the religious and cultural values that the empire represented. The participation of women and children in defensive operations, including the carrying of ammunition and the repair of fortifications, demonstrated the total mobilization that characterized the city's final stand. The clergy's role in maintaining morale through religious services and their presence on the walls during critical moments provided spiritual support that complemented the military leadership provided by the emperor and his professional soldiers. The final Ottoman assault, launched in the early hours of May 29, 1453, represented the culmination of nearly 2 months of systematic siege operations. The coordinated attack, involving simultaneous assaults on the land walls, seawall and harbour chain, demonstrated the tactical sophistication that characterized Ottoman military planning. The preliminary bombardment, conducted throughout the night of May 28th, created multiple breaches in the fortifications while exhausting the defenders through constant alerts and repair work. The assault's timing, beginning before dawn to maximize confusion and minimize the effectiveness of defensive archery, reflected careful consideration of tactical factors that would influence the battle's outcome. The breakthrough achieved by the Janissaries at the Kirka Porta Gate resulted from a combination of tactical skill and fortunate circumstances that finally overcame the defenders' heroic resistance. The discovery of the small gate, which had been left unlocked during a sortie by the defenders, provided the attackers with access to the area between the inner and outer walls. The rapid exploitation of this opportunity, accomplished through the disciplined advance of Janissary units that maintained formation, despite heavy casualties, demonstrated the professional competence that distinguished Ottoman forces from their opponents. The raising of Ottoman banners on the inner wall created panic among the defenders and contributed to the collapse of organised resistance. The death of Constantine XI during the final assault marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the conclusion of over 11 centuries of continuous Roman rule in the East. The emperor's decision to remove his imperial regalia and fight as an ordinary soldier during the final moments reflected both his personal courage and his understanding of the symbolic importance of his presence among the defenders. His body, discovered among the fallen after the battle's conclusion, bore wounds that testified to his active participation in the fighting and his refusal to abandon his city even when defeat became inevitable. The emperor's final words, reportedly declaring his preference for death over surrender, encapsulated the tragic nobility that characterized the empire's final stand. The 3-day sack of Constantinople that followed the city's capture eliminated the last remnants of Byzantine civilization and transformed the former imperial capital into the center of a new Islamic empire. The systematic looting of churches, palaces, and private residences resulted in the destruction or dispersal of artistic treasures that had been accumulated over centuries of imperial rule. The Hagia Sophia's conversion into a mosque, accomplished through the removal of Christian mosaics and the installation of Islamic decorations, symbolized the complete transformation of the city's religious character. The enslavement of thousands of inhabitants, including members of the imperial family and the remaining aristocracy, eliminated the social structures that had supported Byzantine culture. The immediate aftermath of the conquest saw the systematic transformation of Constantinople into the capital of an Islamic empire that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Sultan Mehmed II's entry into the city, accomplished through the same Golden Gate that had welcomed Byzantine emperors for over 1,000 years, marked the beginning of Ottoman rule over territories that had been Christian since the 4th century. The Sultan's visit to the Hagia Sophia, where he ordered the building's conversion into a mosque, demonstrated both his respect for the architectural achievement and his determination to establish Islamic authority over the conquered city. The preservation of Byzantine cultural and religious traditions occurred primarily through the Ottoman millet system, which granted limited autonomy to Christian communities while incorporating them into the broader imperial structure. The appointment of Gennadios Scholarios as ecumenical patriarch, despite his previous opposition to church union, provided Orthodox Christians with recognized leadership while ensuring their loyalty to the new regime. The patriarch's authority over legal and religious matters affecting Orthodox populations created a framework for cultural continuity that would preserve many Byzantine traditions despite the empire's political destruction. The diaspora of Byzantine scholars and artists that followed the conquest facilitated the transmission of classical learning to Western Europe and contributed significantly to the Renaissance movement. The migration of Greek scholars to Italian universities, including figures like Cardinal Bessarion and George of Trebizond, brought manuscript collections and scholarly traditions that had been preserved in Constantinople for centuries. The establishment of Greek studies programs in Western universities created permanent institutional frameworks for the preservation and study of Byzantine intellectual achievements. The influence of Byzantine legal traditions, particularly the Justinian Code, continued to shape European jurisprudence long after the empire's political demise. The survival of Byzantine political traditions in the successor states of Trebizond and the Morea demonstrated the resilience of imperial ideology even after the loss of Constantinople. The Empire of Trebizond, which maintained its independence until 1461, preserved many aspects of Byzantine court ceremony and administrative practice, while adapting to the changed circumstances of the post-1453 world. The Despotate of the Morea, despite its eventual conquest by the Ottomans in 1460, served as a refuge for Byzantine nobles and scholars who sought to maintain their cultural traditions in exile. The lasting influence of Byzantine civilization extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the conquest to encompass fundamental aspects of Eastern European development, Islamic culture, and Western legal and political systems. The Orthodox Christianity that had been shaped by centuries of Byzantine theological development provided the religious foundation for the emerging Russian Empire, which claimed the mantle of the Third Rome after Constantinople's fall. The architectural and artistic traditions developed during the Byzantine period continued to influence Orthodox church construction and decoration throughout Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The Islamic world's relationship with Byzantine cultural achievements reflected both admiration for the empire's intellectual traditions and the practical benefits of incorporating its administrative and legal systems. The Ottoman preservation of Byzantine administrative practices, particularly in the areas of taxation and provincial governance, demonstrated the practical value of imperial institutions that had been refined over centuries of experience. The continued use of Greek as an administrative language in certain regions of the Ottoman Empire reflected the persistence of Byzantine cultural influence even under Islamic rule. The Renaissance movement in Western Europe drew heavily on Byzantine preservation of classical texts and scholarly traditions that had been lost in the West during the medieval period. The availability of Greek manuscripts and the expertise of Byzantine scholars who had migrated to Western universities provided the foundation for the revival of classical learning that characterized the Renaissance. The influence of Byzantine political theory, particularly concepts of imperial authority and the relationship between church and state, continued to shape European political development long after the empire's demise. The modern legacy of the Byzantine Empire encompasses both the preservation of its cultural achievements and the continued influence of its political and religious institutions. The ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, despite its reduced circumstances, maintains its position as the spiritual centre of Orthodox Christianity and continues to exercise influence over Orthodox communities worldwide. The legal principles developed during the Byzantine period, particularly those codified in the Justinian Code, continue to influence modern European legal systems and international law. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, marked not merely the end of a medieval empire, but the conclusion of a continuous tradition of Roman rule that had endured for over 2 millennia. The Byzantine Empire's transformation from the eastern portion of the Roman Empire into a distinctly Greek Christian state, its survival through centuries of external threats and internal challenges, and its final heroic resistance against overwhelming odds, created a historical legacy that continues to inspire and inform our understanding of political resilience, cultural adaptation, and the complex relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The empire's influence on the development of Orthodox Christianity, the preservation of classical learning, and the evolution of European political institutions ensures that its memory will endure long after the last echoes of its final battle have faded into history.